Hi everyone. Good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you.
For Ashley, meeting Jason was a certain salvation. A dark, empty hole had been growing in her soul until that moment. The girl from a wealthy family had never known rejection. Her mother, a former Miss Universe, cared only about not losing the attention of men, and she, like a perpetual motion machine, made her run to fitness gyms, fashion salons, and beauticians. But she had little interest in her daughter. The father was much older than the mother, calm, attentive, and so dear, but all the time was at work. He paid attention, but it was not enough, and sometimes it even seemed like he was hiding from some of life's problems at work. Ashley always dressed better and had the best clothes. Teachers were a little wary of her. For this, she was disliked by her classmates. At university, studying became a salvation, and she liked everything around her. New friends and girlfriends appeared. First love, which was bitter and destructive. And she fell in love with the most attractive, handsome man. He was so good that next to this guy, her brain just seemed to shut off, and she realized that he was from a very rich, powerful family. He loved no one but himself, and he treated all of his ex-girlfriends with condescension and arrogance. He made fun of behind their backs. It was at that moment, when she didn't hear him discussing his ex-girlfriend, calling her obscene words, that she should have stopped and realized that she would become the next one. But she couldn't resist the animal passion. Ashley had always been noted for her intelligence and cleverness. Looking at her mother, who had only brands in her head, she tried to become completely different. She studied on her own. Graduated from high school with honors, but without a medal. At university, she immersed herself in her studies. She wanted to break stereotypes, to be not only beautiful, but also smart. The first beauty of the university, she was noticed by that handsome man and made another tick. If Ashley loved him with all her heart and soul, opened her welcoming arms for him, gave her purity and innocence, then for him she became the next check mark. As soon as he played with her, he just stopped communicating. I tried to meet, to call, but he did not respond. One day I saw him outside the university from the window. He was in an embrace with his classmate. It all made sense. Her subconscious was screaming to leave and not make a scene to preserve her dignity. But her emotions overwhelmed her. She approached, asked. Faced with an overwhelming amount of unpleasant words and ridicule, her heart bled, her soul emptied. After that, there was an emptiness. I couldn't concentrate on my studies. I couldn't seem to breathe. One day, walking in the park, in a state of complete apathy and detachment from reality, she sat on a bench, and there were trees all around, tranquility, the smell of pine trees. There was emptiness in her soul. There was pain in her heart. Even the fact that there was no one to tell, she didn't want to give her friends a reason to gossip. You couldn't tell your father. And her mother? She didn't want to say anything. She kept it all to herself. In her heart, in her soul. She seemed to be crumbling from the inside out. She hadn't slept much lately. Nothing interested her. She wanted to forget everything and start over, but she couldn't. You look very sad, she heard suddenly. She almost jumped on the bench. She turned and saw a good-looking man of about 25, staring at her with an easy and open smile. For some reason, his appearance inspired confidence. Although Ashley had always been feisty, this time she decided to just ignore it, turning away without answering anything. I wanted to cry. Don't be sad. You're so beautiful. You'll be fine, he said in a very soft, gentle, and confident voice. When she heard that, she calmed down. He turned away immediately, seeing that she didn't want to talk to him. Jason sighed sadly. He never met a girl like this before. But when he saw her on the bench in the park, he couldn't pass her by. And so delicate, refined, exquisite, but with sad, empty eyes. He knew that look, a look of hopelessness and indifference. And what was her problem? Beautifully dressed, obviously from a wealthy family, so everything can be changed. Why the incredible sadness? He wanted something to help. And what he'd do. After all, sometimes a few nice friendly words can help a person to return to the true path and overcome internal problems. It is with the help of conversation that psychologists save people. Yeah, I'm not having much fun, but that doesn't concern you. Mind your own business. And I wanted to say something to put him in his place. Ashley looked at him with a demeaning, haughty, cold stare. Yeah, that's right. No offense. Just wanted to help. He smiled in a very pleasant and friendly way. Ashley saw a rather handsome, athletic guy in front of her, probably looking for another victim, just like her ex. All men are the same. An unbearable ache reappeared in her soul. How could she hate them all? And I don't meet on the street, so don't try. It's not going to work, Ashley said with a little hatred in her voice and turned away. Oh, I'm sorry, I just wanted to do something to help. He stood up, picked up the cane that was beside him, and walked slowly, leaning on it. Ashley looked up at him, embarrassed. It was embarrassing. This guy, despite the fact that he was an invalid himself, tried to support her. She stood up and caught up with him. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's take a walk together, she smiled, and he smiled back at her. From that moment on, they met almost daily. At first, a strong friendship developed between them, trust in each other, mutual support. Jason was raised in an orphanage, was disabled, received an apartment from the state, to which Ashley came quite often, helped him clean, do laundry, buy groceries. Despite his disability, he worked online all the time, taking on any even difficult jobs. I'm doing my best, Ashley. I still have that balcony to fix. See? I'm almost done with the repairs, just a little bit more. If I could get married, they laughed. But Ashley really admired him. He was so strong. He worked out on the bar at home every day and had such an attractive, handsome, pumped-up body. From their friendship, it had been a real lifesaver for her. Even the anger, the hatred she felt for her ex just went away. It was like she was cleansed of all the negativity. She became free. She realized that when you overcome such moments, you become stronger and wiser. And if what happened to her hadn't happened, maybe she never would have met Jason. And he had become so close to her, such a dear, close friend, a best friend, someone she could tell everything to. It's really cozy here. When I come to you, I feel like I'm finally home, where I'm welcome, where it's warm. She rolled her eyes dreamily. I'm glad. He looked at her with sadness and boundless love. He was philosophical about life. He understood that it was difficult for the poor to get through. He knew that physical limitations imposed their imprint on life. But despite this, he aspired and dreamed. I knew that anything was possible if you wanted it bad enough. But as soon as he saw Ashley on the bench, he immediately knew she was perfect. His heart pounded harder. But there was no chance, and even now that they were best friends, he realized he couldn't give her anything good. But she came from a rich family, a girl who had everything one could dream of. And what was he? It's nothing, just a small detail in the workings of the capitalist machine. His life, his destiny, is a game of cards, and if you're lucky, you'll be happy. If you're unlucky, there's nothing you can do to build your world. So what are you thinking? Ashley was looking at him very carefully. I guess I'm thinking that I love you, but I can't give you anything with my love, only care. He decided to tell the truth for some reason. Ashley raised her eyebrows in surprise, but in truth she'd known for a long time that Jason loved her. She felt something for him, too, but there was a limiter inside that warned her not to make any hasty decisions. She'd cleverly reduced the conversation to a friendly love affair. But she realized that it was about something more sublime. She had not yet fully realized her feelings, but she felt incredibly comfortable with him. She could confide all her secrets. She consulted him, and often stayed with him. But most importantly, he had never, until that day, hinted at bed or any personal relationship. Everything was somehow in itself sincere, pure, and incredibly open. And I guess that's what true love is. There was no crazy passion, which was replaced by pain and disappointment. There was stability, openness, complete trust. Before she left for home, Ashley looked at him one more time. Amazing, so gentle and beautiful, with crazy red hair like a carrot, mustache and glasses and green eyes, kind and bottomless, and so smiling, so unnatural in these modern times. If he'd born a woman, he'd be worth nothing with such looks. But he was born inexplicably, where inexplicably by whom he was brought up by the state. Aha, he was immersed in a world of temptation, where he could only exist, and incredibly strong, without having a disability, something with his leg having hope of recovery. Since an expensive surgery could make him whole, but having no real possibility, the guy was not discouraged, struggled and lived. Created his paradise hut in the hope that someday he would bring his beloved here. Courageous, despite the fact that most of his time was spent at the computer, doing something, learning programming. He started every morning with exercise. There was no passion between them, but there was something stronger. Ashley decided to set the table at his place on her birthday and spend the holiday for the first time with someone who was truly family to her. And every year until her 4th year, she had gone home on this day. "It's going to be okay," he said. And the girl absolutely understood what he was thinking. Their future would be difficult. It would be hard to give up everything she had previously considered basic needs. But branded clothes, expensive cosmetics, various jewelry, this is not happiness, not life. She will never be like her mother. Alex Adamson's indifferent, soulless father. A respected businessman who was rarely at home and saw no emotion from his wife. The mother was indifferent to anything that didn't have a brand or label on it. The father was nothing but a huge wallet. This, however, did not make the man suffer at all. There was like an unspoken agreement between them, whereby he was rich and Ashley was beautiful. At any events, they transformed into a couple in love, played masterfully, and at home just scattered into different rooms. No scandals, no emotions. A family reunion even sounds awful. Think back on it all. Ashley wrinkled her nose. Maybe not going. But she missed her dad a lot. "I have a great dad." Ashley looked at Jason. "He'll be sure to introduce you," he smiled. "Sure," he said. "I'll miss you. So call and write more often." "Deal." Ashley couldn't sleep for a long time. She kind of wanted to go home. She really missed her dad. She hadn't seen him much before, but he had always been a true friend to her. So she realized that he would understand and say, "Press forward." And now she had a loved one who was even closer than her dad. So how would her father feel about her chosen one? Never talked to him about this future, about her marriage. But most likely he will not be happy about a son-in-law with no family and tribe, no money. Her father was her friend, but he was a hard, harsh, and cruel man. So it was hard to imagine his rebel man. He needed to be prepared for it. Ashley didn't want to leave Jason. She needed to be there for him. And some inner feeling in her gut told her that he was always on the verge of fighting for life and wanting to die. And even though outwardly he was incredibly positive, strong, and determined, Ashley knew that wasn't always the case. At night, often stroking his arms, marred with scars, small scars, and some were very old, others more recent. How many times had this man, who had no goals, no family, and knew no love, picked up a blade, lay down in a hot bath, and slashed the past, trying to rid himself of the feeling of being unwanted and reconnect with the universe. Why did this man feel like a stranger in life? A lot of things became clear to her after seeing those scars. There was no point in his life to make it up on his own, to continue his path and to nip himself, to make repairs to the apartment, to master programming, to finish the repair. That is it okay to leave him for a whole month? Yes, you can. He will wait. Everything will be fine. Everything will be exactly as it should be. He's responsible not only for his own life, but for hers. And so he's not likely to do anything stupid. In the morning, Jason just walked her out, trying not to think about being alone again. So when you left him, his mother just brought him to the orphanage and then had her parental rights terminated. He said he tried to find her, searching through every thread he could find, but he couldn't find her. He was about 7 or 8 years old when his mother brought him in and gave him away herself. So I remember her crazy red hair, her green fox eyes, the huge scar on her left cheek. Jason continued, eyes full of grief and hopelessness. She told him then that she loved him, but that she couldn't be a good mother, and said she was the reason he was now disabled, and because of her he had no chance for a future. Maybe life will be gracious and you can accomplish a lot. Maybe someone will take you in and you'll have a future, but not with me, she was saying. The large tears flowed from his mother Alice's eyes as he saw that picture again now. It's a beautiful, eye-catching, but tired and unhappy mommy. I'll work. We'll get through this. I'll always be there for you, she said. He didn't understand much at the time, but he knew for sure that he wanted to be by her side. He loved his mother with all his heart. Son, remember me, she said, wiped off from her neck a very thin chain with a small pendant that looked like a lady daisy, 8-petaled. Don't give it to anyone. It's a picture of you and me. It was a gift from your grandmother, and I've done so many stupid things. I don't belong on this earth. I love you. Remember that always. Always have and always will. Mommy, he snuggled up to her with his whole body, smelled the warm scent of steamed milk and cheap perfume with a hint of pine scent. It was a scent he could sort of smell now. Mommy, all these thoughts made him indescribably sad. Honey, I'll be right back, she said. Ashley didn't love her chosen one. She wanted to take him with her, but she knew it was premature. "Okay, call more often," she bade. He said. He hugged her again, as he had as a child, breathing in her scent. The scent of the woman he loved. The smell was incredibly delicate and pleasant, delightful. He could smell the delicate notes of lilac. So it seemed that the scent of the woman he loved had completely displaced the scent of his beloved mother from his memory. Arriving home, Ashley immediately met her mother. "Oh my God, my darling." Her mother rushed over to hug and kiss her. "You've grown up in these 6 months." The pretty girl began to look at Ashley. Mommy didn't miss her. She snuggled up to her, but felt a certain detachment. "Honey, do you remember when I bought you that dress?" She adjusted her yellow, impossibly gorgeous outfit. "Tell me how you, Olivia, looking at your daughter, saw your little mere replica. She seems nice, but she's gray. We should buy her a good groom. Like she bought any toy she wanted." "It's okay, Mom, the session's over. Everything's fine. My daughter put the coffee on the bar. Do you want coffee?" "It's not healthy. I only drink fresh juice." But she gave her a disdainful look. "Don't you ever go to the hairdresser?" It always amazed Ashley that her mother somehow didn't care about her emotions, her spirituality. The only thing Olivia cared about was appearance and beauty. And now her own daughter, who hadn't been around for more than 6 months, whose eyes were shining with mad love, was getting attention only in the matter of her hair. It even became kind of unpleasant. Of course it's important. A woman must always remain a woman, beautiful, well-groomed, gorgeous, so otherwise men will not love. I looked proudly at my outside, reflection in the huge refrigerator. "Does your father love you?" asked the daughter with a challenge. "Perhaps he doesn't love me, but he appreciates and respects me," the mother said with a little sadness in her voice. "Love, my dear, is not the most important thing in a relationship. Have you ever been in love? But you really wondered, Mother is so cold. Has she ever had love?" He did. She sat down at the table. "Let's have some coffee." She got sad. "Thought you don't have to tell me if you don't want to." She felt her mother's pain and immediately felt sorry for her. "He loved your father with all my heart, Alex Sergei. He was so attentive and gentle. He wooed you so beautifully. I loved him. I was just like you. Naive, pure, not without the fact that you wouldn't date a poor man. But it wasn't just money. He wasn't so rich then, moderately wealthy." Ashley set a nice, small sugar cup on the table. "No, thank you." She tried to make the atmosphere more pleasant, and it was sugar. The girl put her cup on the table and began to stir. "Your father was so well looked after. I fell in love with him, and he never loved me. He had the only love of his life, some hippie. He still has her picture," my mother sighed sadly again. "I found out when I was pregnant with you, and I thought, it's no big deal. I'll be able to break him. She'll love me." She was smart. "You won't believe it. I learned to be an actress, never cross him. And he pretended to love me, but then he started to drift away." "Mom, you cannot tell me if you do not want to." Daughter did not want to rake up the past. "No, I'll tell you. He stopped coming to my bedroom, and at night he sat and studied until morning. I came in once, and he was asleep on the desk where her pictures were. We haven't lived as husband and wife for London. That's the only joy, shopping and beauty society, popping and beauty and all that." Just like that, it all became obvious to Ashley. We'd really just become indifferently thing, and it was all Dad's fault. It was horrible to imagine that Mom loved him sincerely and honestly, as she loved no one. For the first time, her daughter saw her with tears in her eyes, sincere tears. "Father, but he loved, but another. How terrible it is to live and know that your favorite person does not reciprocate you, or doesn't love you, doesn't appreciate you, just uses you as a social element." It brought Jason to mind. "Honey, how much did you miss him? But why don't you leave your father? You're so beautiful. You'll find love." She truly felt sorry for her mother. "You may not believe me, but I still love him. I don't mean to look indifferent, but I do. I still have hope in my heart." "Mommy, calm down." Her daughter hugged her, talked to him. "No, and don't tell him anything. Why didn't Ashley always think that all family problems were because people couldn't be honest with each other? It doesn't make sense. She's long since made her peace with it, and it's unlikely that anything will change." Adam was open and frank for the first time in the last 20 years. All this time she'd been playing a role as a careless person, fascinated only by appearances. It was once a game, but in time it became routine. "Maybe, but I think it's still worth talking about." Ashley said what she thought. She knew that openness and honesty could be the answer to anything. She could see that her mother truly loved her father, so she thought that attitude could be reanimated. Dan was greatly distressed by the memories, so Ashley did not talk about the difficulties she had with her loved one. Ashley wanted to start living with Jason, but she realized that it was important to talk to her father about the relationship. And she needed to get his blessing, and doing that wasn't going to be as easy as it seemed. But her father seemed to always be on her side. But the truth was, if she told him about Jason being disabled and from an orphanage, there was a good chance her father wouldn't accept her choice. And that wasn't even what scared her. She realized that she would be able to finish her studies, And then she would have studies, and then she would work full-time and cope with any difficulties. But she wasn't counting on her father's money. But she was afraid that he'd start pushing her around and maybe bring Jason back. I actually wanted to make him happy, and in no way wanted to be a source of trouble for him. Dad came home from work in the evening. "My princess, how happy am I to see you?" And the emotional connection with his daughter was very great. No one in his life he loved as much as he loved her. So worried that the little girl's future would be cloudless, without problems. That's why he worked and tried, put everything aside for her sake. "Daddy," she threw herself around his neck and sank into a soft but confident embrace. "How good of you to come. Why didn't you say it was today? I would have met you yesterday." He shifted his eyebrows theatrically and made a stern look. "I wanted to surprise you." His daughter looked at him with eyes full of delight. Daddy always knew how to look gorgeous. Ashley realized now that he must have had a million girls running after him, and he didn't like his mother. I wonder what was the one he loved, the one who had conquered his mind for years. Or maybe Mom is wrong, and he just keeps some resentment on his soul. So they have no real family, but just a visual deception. "Surprise Mom," he said with a certain monotony. "Yeah, she and I already had coffee. What did you look like? Is he gorgeous?" But the eyes are sad. Ashley had always been able by some subconscious, inexplicable instinct to see his troubles. Right now the visibility was without unrest, but the unrest was inside him. "Yeah, some difficulties at work, but that's all minor stuff as usual. How are your studies?" In peaceful conversations they met the evening. Then the family sat down to dinner. Everything was as it always was, perfect, as if her parents had rehearsed dinner or breakfast in the evenings. No bickering, no complaints. Artificial smiles, honey, just like in the best movies. And if an outsider got here, at this ordinary dinner table, they would probably think of the perfect family in front of them. And Ashley was the only one who knew it was a game. Now she found out that her mother was not a soulless doll, but a normal and adequate woman who would put on a mask because of her inner pain and disappointment in love. For several days, Ashley did not dare to talk to her father. The situation irritated her, and there was no doubt in her mind that she loved Jason and wanted to be with him. On the evenings, they texted for hours about absolutely nothing. When she tried to be supportive of the guy, as she was afraid that loneliness might play tricks on him again. "Honey, I want to talk to my dad about us. But I don't dare," she tried to make her voice carefree, as if, by the way, "That's okay. We'll talk some other time." Jason was somehow completely unaware of her doubts and anxiety, and I was thinking of moving in with you starting next semester. Is that okay with you? When they talked to him about it more than once. And while last time she told herself she needed to think about it, today Ashley was sure she wanted to move in with Jason, and as soon as possible. Sure, move in. His voice trailed off. The boy adored Ashley. She was the center of the universe and the center of his life. He wanted to live for her, to create, to build, to create. He wanted to do something beyond what he could do, just to live and breathe the air she breathed. For the first time in his life, Jason felt happy again. Every time he looked at himself in the mirror, he thought about how his mother had abandoned him because of his looks and disability, unattractive, unreliable, because of his leg and disobedience, capable. He tormented himself with many doubts and torments. And when Ashley came into his life, everything became completely different. Jason stopped thinking about his mother, stopped thinking about the past. He opened the door to the present and the future. Every night the girl called him, telling him how her day was, and he spent all day working on an old chair in the garage. Ashley had once expressed an enthusiasm for antiques. Jason remembered that he had an old chair in his garage that could be restored. The old thing was slowly being transformed. There was a lot of work to do, but in a month his sweetheart would arrive, and it would be the best gift ever. Time passed more quickly, but Jason still had anxious thoughts. He imagined that Ashley wouldn't tell her father, that she wouldn't let her come here, wouldn't let her see him. It was a possibility. And then what would happen? What would he have to live for? No, he'll be happy. He'll have a big family. He'll be strong forever. That's what Ashley had taught him. So the girl was getting ready to take the first step in the conversation. The father stayed home over the weekend. Her mother had left for another procedure, and Ashley and her dad decided to have dinner together. Their everything is always traditionally beautiful. Mary Johnson, their housekeeper and housekeeper, set everything up. To Mary, you may be dismissed. Get some rest, I'll take care of Daddy. Ashley smiled at her favorite housekeeper, who had always been like a grandmother to Quamper. Okay, dear, she asked her host again. Alex Adamson, can I go now? Well, of course. If the daughter wants to take care of her father, so be it. He smiled, then bon appetit. So Mary Johnson dutifully checked everything on the table and left. Meanwhile, Ashley and his father were enjoying the stew, which was delicious and flavorful. As soon as the housekeeper left, Ashley decided to start the conversation. Dad, tell me, have you ever really loved someone? She tried to speak nonchalantly to make her block sound pleasant. A shadow of inner disappointment ran across his face. A sadness appeared in his eyes. You don't have to say anything if you want to. Ashley hoped that he, like her mother, would be frank with her. What was the point of this conversation? He looked at her carefully and shrewdly. I'm in love, she paused tragically. Good. And who is the lucky man? Father said with surprise. His little princess had grown up and become an adult. The father looked at her carefully and penetratingly, all grown up. He will have to part with her. She will live in another house. Well, I'll introduce you, of course. First I faced betrayal, and he supported me, became my best friend, then my favorite person. I can't imagine living without him. Jason's a wonderful man, Ashley said at length, describing everything in the best colors and tones. But most importantly, she left out the information about her lover's disability and lack of a steady job. Her father looked at her too harshly and strictly, but her words touched the man's soul. He remembered his only love, a beautiful American woman with red hair, bright eyes, and gentle hands. Can you hear me? Ashley noticed that the man's thoughts were somewhere far away. He'd remembered his life. Can you tell me so romantically that it brought back memories of my love? He lowered his eyes, tears seeming to well up in them. What are you talking about, Mom? Ashley knew the answer, but she wanted to hear the story from him. Your mom is someone I respect a lot. She's perfect, but I love someone else so much. He decided to answer his daughter with honesty on honesty. And who? The girl tried to make an interested look. As soon as I started doing business, I met her. Very beautiful, but attracted in her another thing. But she was lively, so free in everything. We started seeing each other, and I found out she had a kid, but it didn't scare me. Everything was so cool and romantic, and she was special. But as soon as I asked her to move in with me, she ran away. I looked for her afterward, and just like that, I got a bottle. You want some good wine? Yeah. Ashley didn't want wine. She wanted to talk, make her father soften up. Then maybe it would be okay to talk about everything. He heard a lot about her, but no facts, she said with a heavy sigh. Father, you never saw each other again? No, I met your mom a year later. Got married, but it's hard to forget Ashley. Life was kind of colorful, different. When she left, there was an emptiness. Everything faded. He took a gulp of wine. I see my mother was right about my father torturing her instead of loving her, Ashley thought. And you know when colors came back into my life? He looked questioningly at his daughter. When you were born, you were my salvation in life, became bright again. So that's the way Mom and I live our lives. Everything is good with us. You have opportunities now. Don't you want to find your love? It was really incomprehensible to her daughter why her parents were not divorcing, but torturing each other. No, not anymore. I have a family, the father said confidently. But a family is not a sentence. Why are you tormenting Mom? She looked at him with eyes full of hatred. Yes, your mother is well off. She never thinks about anything but money. Though I think she once loved me, my father almost shouted. Loved and loves. Ashley jumped up. She's become like that because of you, the one who loved you so much. He dedicated poems to me. He drank the wine again in a gulp. What makes you think Mom doesn't love you? Ashley, tone it down a little. I don't. It's just the way it seemed to me. Mom told me herself that she did and does. And knew you loved someone else and suffered. Ashley stammered, but she had promised her mother not to tell. Her voice trembled. Her father stared very intently. Interesting. You surprised me. I thought she was indifferent. After this conversation, Father remembered the past. That love with whom there was no equal that made him unhappy. She didn't conquer him with her beauty, but with something else. She wrote him poems that told of true love, so she was a free bird. She didn't want to depend on him. He lied to his daughter without telling the truth. And they lived together. She had a baby boy Alex wanted to adopt. He was willing to work around the clock for her. And she needed attention. She often went off without telling him where she was going, leaving the baby unattended. He'd freak out, scream, and she'd sit and watch him. The first time they were madly passionate. They did what they wanted. He'd rush home to her from work faster. Then he started staying out longer. She got other men, and he got jealous. One day he saw her with another. They were just talking, but when they got home, Alex was furious, insulting, humiliating, threatening to take the baby away. After that, she was gone in the morning. No belongings, left heartbroken. He looked for her. She was living with another man, demanding nothing, but incredibly violent. He beat her. She ran away. Where to? Unknown. He searched for her for a long time, but to no avail. He wanted to prove to himself and to her that if she came back, he'd made a mistake. So I married Olivia. She was delicate, tender, vulnerable. But later on, she became more daring. He remembered the moment that split their lives apart. After the birth, she came into the office. Who is this woman, Alex? She looked up with eyes full of tears. Beloved, he said with defiance. What about me, your spouse? She looked with sadness and hope. And what about you? Don't you have enough money? What, you don't have enough Miss Universes? He did not believe in her love. But hear me, you will never be loved by me again. Money is money. And she walked away with her head held proudly high. Always perfect in public, she conjured up the image of a perfect family. She was surprised. This evening had come as a surprise to him. Taneka, his daughter, the little girl who had kept the fire of life burning in him, was now an adult and would soon be married. Who is this man? Can he make Ashley happy? Just questions. We'd have to get to know each other. And he really hoped that his daughter's chosen one loved her, not the money she had. After all, that happens quite a lot these days. He hoped that his daughter would be happy and not, like him, gaze expectantly at the women passing by, hoping to see the one. He pulled out the pictures. The red-haired girl looked up at him coquettishly from the snapshot as he began to go through the family photos. Olivia was everywhere in them, happy, with a beautiful smile, the happiest possible image. He really thought his spouse was happy with the unlimited limit card she was using. and it turned out that she loved and suffered. Is that so? If the wife has been suffering all this time, living her pain, then maybe it's not too late to change everything. Yet he'd already lost the woman he loved because of his pride. And Olivia, a friend of his 4 decades, always uncomplaining, always near, ready to come to the rescue. So maybe he should try again? But now to meet his daughter's fiancé first. Ashley said she'd get together with him, try to live together. So it was necessary to get to know his future in-laws. Something inside him told him that his daughter wasn't telling him something, and something out there was clearly wrong. "Hey, Olivia." The secretary entered the office where he was sitting in his thoughts. "I was wondering, do we have any meetings or events next week? I need to make plans." She came in every Sunday, asking such questions, and then she would plan everything properly and efficiently. "No, Olivia." He looked at her extremely carefully. "Can you stay?" Olivia looked surprised, but stopped, closed the door, walked gracefully to the couch, and sat down. He got up and walked over to her and sat down beside her. "Have you really loved me all these years and waited for the attention I didn't give you? Listen to me in a businesslike manner with complete indifference," he asked his wife. "Do you know your daughter wants to get married? She said she was in love, but to get married." Olivia was really surprised. "Yes, she wants to live with him together from next semester." He sat even closer. "What do you think?" "I think if she loves him, let her try. If it's love, they'll live together no matter what. And if it's not, they'll be divorced quickly," Olivia said wisely. "God, she's beautiful, resilient, wise. Why have I never looked at her as a real woman? Always thought she was mercantile from day one, because she was just convenient. And now my daughter has suddenly opened my eyes," he thought. "What has this woman done? Why have I tormented her for years, neglecting her and replacing it with money? It's not Olivia's fault that I lost my first love, and then made up my own misery, making her suffer as well." He didn't know how he should start the conversation. Yes, it was all amazing. With his wife, everything was always discussed dryly and specifically, like in the office. "Do you believe that she fell in love? Could there be such a thing?" he asked, and Olivia looked at him with eyes full of wonder. "Did you love me?" he asked in almost a whisper. Olivia was even more surprised, staring and not understanding. "I did," she lowered her eyes. And now the man was looking at her penetratingly. Olivia lowered her head and looked away. Gently, he turned her toward him and looked into her eyes. "Say yes, but I realized it when you said you loved and would love someone else all the time," she said, tears welling up in her voice. "My darling, let's try it all over again." He drew her to him and hugged her. Why, she did not understand the changes that had happened to her husband. To be happy, from that day their relationship became completely different. It was as if their feelings had sharpened. They had really decided to make a fresh start. Not a fresh start, but a fresh start. Olivia really had become an incredibly happy woman. She had a man by her side who surrounded her with care and attention that she had never, in fact, known. When her daughter left, she was insanely happy for her parents, realizing that she had a hand in it. And she knew that without her, they would not have started a new phase of their lives, would not have built a new relationship. Her father promised that very soon he would come to meet his future son-in-law. Naturally, Ashley was not very much afraid, but at the same time she realized that without it, it would be impossible to build a future with her chosen one. Ashley worried that there might be difficulties in the relationship between her father and Jason. But after all, they were so different. Dad clearly knew what he was aiming for. He was always tough. Jason was completely different, soft, gentle, vulnerable. She felt sorry that these two completely different people would have to communicate. They might have a hard time building a relationship. Arriving in town, Ashley went straight to Jason's house. "I missed you so much. I feel like we haven't seen each other in forever." She hugged him and wouldn't let go. It seemed to Ashley that if she let him go, he would disappear. There was a calmness in her soul right now around this man. She truly loved him. It was hard without him. When she saw him, she just couldn't tear herself away, hugging and kissing the one person she wanted to be open and real with. "But how was your trip?" He smiled gently and hugged her tightly. It was great. Her trip had had incredible results, but her parents had reconciled, or rather, had become close to each other. The only thing she didn't want to talk about was talking to her father about how she'd never really told him anything about Jason. "That's fine. Come see my present." It was amazing how this man, who'd been a stranger 6 months ago, could sense her mood. And she didn't want to talk about the conversation with her father, but he didn't ask. It was like a gut feeling. That was it a gift. She was well aware that he didn't have much money and wouldn't be able to satisfy her wishes. Ashley had long ago decided that she didn't need valuables, rich gifts. She only needed his love, sincere love, and someone in life. With the help of parents, money seeks power and fame. But she didn't need anything, just him around. "I wonder what you want to give me. Are you going to treat me to something?" "But let's go look," she said, leaning on her wand. He took her hand and led her to the garage, opened the door, and before her stood a magnificent vintage, luxurious, rare chair, beautifully restored. Fantastic. She adored things like this. It seemed that the Queen's maid of honor had once sat in this chair. It was amazing how this man had accomplished such a miracle with his own hands. It was most likely an antique chair, and he had restored it, cleaned it, made it beautiful, all for her once upon a time. She used to tell him that she liked that sort of thing. Used to dream that when she had her own house, she'd buy a huge amount of stuff like this. And then she'd met Jason and realized that a lot of the things she used to dream about would never come true. I didn't want to tell him anything about the money. She knew he wouldn't be able to fulfill her desires, and so she shouldn't have made him feel inferior. And now she clearly realized that this close, kind-hearted person felt her very subtly. Even without money, he was trying to realize her dreams. The chair was delightful. She threw herself on his neck, hugged him, and shed tears. And he laughed. Realized they were tears of happiness. He didn't ask any stupid questions. He just smiled, hugged her, and kissed her crying eyes. So the days went by merrily and carefree. Ashley realized that very soon she would become a specialist, go to work. They could live a full, independent life. And she told him she was moving out, and a few days later she did move in. They formed a small but dignified family. Everyone supported and understood each other. He even helped her write her notes. And it was so tender and romantic that Ashley was just thrilled. The only thing that scared her over and over again was that she never told him ever again. And someday she would have to. One day there was a knock on the door. Ashley opened it. It was her father on the doorstep. She'd left the address with her mom just in case. Now she realized it was the wrong decision. She realized there was no other way her dad could have done it. He had just come unannounced, rushed over to talk and see everything with his own eyes. Dad was surprised and heartbroken. Ashley wasn't ready for such a conversation, much less a meeting. Neither was Jason. She was afraid that now Dad might hurt him, and things wouldn't go the way she had planned. They had had such a good life. Everything had been wonderful. And now it might all be ruined because of Dad, who, not understanding the situation, was bound to do something wrong. That would be a shame. Ashley's only hope was that Jason would understand her, that he would understand and forgive her for Dad. Though yes, he loved her, would understand that she couldn't do otherwise, couldn't leave an address, which meant this situation was inevitable. You don't understand, are you surprised? But I decided to come and meet my son-in-law, take a look. "How do you live here? Maybe you need some help." Without pausing, the father said. He realized that Ashley was in a certain stupor, but at the same time he couldn't take it anymore. Every day the thought lived in a corner that he had absolutely no idea who he had given his daughter to, who was now in charge of her life and her well-being. So he made a decision for himself to go and figure it all out. Olivia, of course, objected, but he always acted independently and decisively. While the cameraman had her a bag of groceries and started to slowly come around, "Dad, we weren't expecting guests at all," Ashley said trite, meaningless phrases. She realized that there was nothing she could change, nothing to worry about. "I bought everything to set the table." Her father walked into the kitchen, looked around, stunned. Poverty Khrushchevcha with thin walls, a complete lack of any comfort. In the kitchen, an old banished stove, no dishwasher, just a nightmarish environment that cannot be described in words. And he even felt like a rat was about to run through somewhere. Not because it's dirty, but because it's old, shabby, and miserable. Dad went into the living room. How can you call it a living room? A hall with shabby old carpets, old shabby carpets that come from the Soviet Union. It's a wonder they're still there. Is this really where his daughter lives? You couldn't tell from looking at her that she was unhappy, smiling, cheerful, fresh. What's going on here? It's so disgusting, so horrible, it's impossible. One room that acted as a living room and a bedroom. Everything here was kind of frozen in time, old cabinets, an intimidating couch. But in the center of this terrifying room was a gorgeous vintage armchair. It was probably the only element here that wasn't disgusting. "Where's my future son-in-law?" Dad tried to hold back the nausea closing in on him. He went to the store, the daughter practically whispered, as she saw the look in the man's eyes. He realized what he was thinking. Realized something terrible was about to happen. Dad saw the jowls on his cheeks begin to run and the pulse gray on his neck. She realized he was about to explode, and with any luck, he'd be gone before Jason got there, which meant there would be no scandal. But if she was unlucky, the scandal would break when the future son-in-law came in fusion of her father. She was very afraid, but she was even more afraid of losing Jason. So she pulled herself together and looked at her dad with a stern, even stern look. Julie suddenly felt as if she were a small copy of him. She could feel the jowls on her cheeks and the veins in her neck throbbing. "Go away, just go away." Her daughter said it, even with a slight tear in her voice. It seemed that she was about to start the scandal herself. Kick him out of here. Scream and never want to talk to him, scream. Her father turned to her in surprise, looking at her, not understanding how his little princess, delicate, refined, so exquisite, suddenly turned into a resident of a communal apartment, defending her square meters. It would have been a serious scandal if the door hadn't opened and Jason hadn't appeared on the doorstep. But he looked at the stranger who stood next to his beloved in surprise, and guessed it was her father, who always understood everything without words. Sort of sensed it with some inner, almost animal instinct. "Good afternoon." "And we have guests." He extended his hand to her father in a friendly manner. A little confused, Ashley introduced the two to each other. Despite the fact that her father actually turned pale, shook hands with his future son-in-law, looked at him disdainfully, and even disparagingly, took another look. Yes, handsome, athletic, pumped-up figure. But an invalid, standing leaning on a stick, Alex Adamson thought regretfully. It was awful. That is, his beautiful daughter Ashley, who had a huge dowry, unlimited financial opportunities, now lives with a disabled person in this shabby apartment of Khrushchev's time. The world must have gone mad. It's probably just asleep. I need to pinch myself, wake up soon. But for Alex Adamson, everything was so terrible it seemed unreal. Seating her father with a table in the hall, Ashley surreptitiously began preparing the table with cheesy, old Soviet plates. Somewhere an open crystal vase she poured the salad into. It was all as if he was about to get into a time machine and travel back in time, but Dad held on. As everyone sat down at the table and drank some wine, he suddenly decided to have a final talk with his daughter. He realized that there was no point in stalling. He had to dot his I's and cross his T's. He didn't want to talk to Jason, though. Asked him where he worked. He said computer, so nowhere. And that finally convinced him that he needed to talk to him right now. There was no point in putting off such a serious complaint. His mind was screaming at him to stop, realized that now he could lose his daughter forever. His grievances were burning her soul, perhaps sowing a seed of hatred between father and daughter. But temper and some demon that had always been in him screamed, "That's it, say it. Get her out of here. Make it right." "Come on, let's go out to the kitchen," he said, practically hissed. Okay, she didn't take Jason's hand. She could see that he'd gone pale. Sensed the storm coming. "It's going to be okay, honey. Honey, love you." So in the kitchen, Dad wouldn't even sit on a stool. He looked at everything with eyes full of disgust. "What is all this, Ashley? What is this?" He couldn't hold back his emotions and he was talking loud enough. "I don't know what you're talking about." His daughter turned away from him, trying to make her voice quieter, as if to motivate him to lower the volume too. "I mean what this is all about. You live in this shabby crack house. There's no living space, nothing to attract you. And this man is cute, yes, but he's disabled. Do you realize that he makes absolutely no money? How are you going to live?" He hesitated more and more with each passing second. This is a man. Is this a man who lives in this shabby room and brought his favorite woman here? The walls in the flats were very thin, so Jason could hear everything. It wasn't pleasant, but he understood why her father was so upset. He probably wouldn't have been thrilled if he were him either, but he also realized that he was precious to Ashley. And he realized that money wasn't the most important thing in life. He didn't want to listen to all that was going on in the kitchen anymore. He started pacing the room, but it was impossible not to hear what was going on in there, and he wanted to come in to say his manly word, and then he realized that all this was meaningless, and it was better to keep silent now. Then his father would leave, and they'd go back to their normal, peaceful lives. Ashley and his father might not talk for a while, but then they would reconcile. Everything will be fine. Her father will eventually accept the situation, or perhaps someday she herself will realize that her father was telling the truth and will leave Jason because of worry and inner discomfort. He walked around the room, picking up the souvenirs that were on the shelf and moving them from place to place, as well as his guitar, then decided to just play and sing a song so he couldn't hear what was going on in the kitchen. In fact, to create a background noise, I ran my thin fingers over the guitar strings and then sang. Dad went pale. Ashley thought his lips quivered. Jason played and sang, and her father changed before her eyes. "How do you know that song?" He was practically screaming. "My mother used to sing it to me," Jason said, surprised but confident, unable to understand what was happening. "You're from the orphanage." His father seemed to be losing his mind. "And she gave me away when I was 7 or 8. He couldn't hide his surprise. "What was her name?" Ashley's father asked, sitting down on the couch. "Alice." "Is she alive?" "I don't know." And that was how fate had brought him to a state where there was an opportunity to correct his mistakes of youth. And this was the same baby he had once rocked in his arms, the son of his only beloved woman, the one he idolized, the one who had made him happy, showed him a whole other vibrant life. He looked at her and realized that the red hair, the green eyes were like Ashley's now more than ever. Another time he realized he had made a mistake. He shouldn't have meddled in his daughter's personal life, and they were happy after all. And maybe that's how happy he would have been with Alice. Together they must have overcome everything. But his insolence, his total control, had changed everything. She left, and then he wandered the world, never able to raise his only child in love and unity. So what can he do to honor his former love? For the woman who made him happy and essentially created him as he is now. It is to give his daughter and son the opportunity to be happy. When he heard the first lines of the song, he realized that these were the very poems his beloved had written to him, poems he remembered all his life. From that moment on, Alex Adamson became more attentive to people and decided to be home more with his wife. By appointing an executive and director in his firm, gave his daughter and son-in-law, who quickly won his heart with his good nature, a house where everything was perfect, told the young ones about his love, talked to Jason a lot about his mother, whom he hardly knew, or showed the photos he'd saved, which he gave away. Jason and Ashley were building their carefree, happy future in their new home. His father paid for the surgery to fix his chromosome and allowed him to run the company website, which allowed him to accompany web-channel clients. And Olivia gained more than just a loved one who finally paid attention to her and showered her with love. To Mary Johnson was preparing to become a mother again.
The train raced through the morning fog. The boundless southern distance flashed past with the green stripe, interspersed with the blue stripe of the river. Beautiful, said an elderly man, a neighbor in the compartment, and poured cognac into his tea. Or would you like tea and bread? No, thank you, John Smith. I don't drink alcohol. It makes my hands shake, said Jake. And I'm a cardiac surgeon. One false move and that's it. A man could die. So if you'll excuse me, I'll pass. Jake stared out at the scenery. I do allow myself the occasional drink, John Smith smiled good-naturedly. It's a good stress reliever. I'm a lawyer. I've seen a lot of things. He took a sip from his glass of tea and looked at Jake questioningly. You're from New York, you said, aren't you? Where are you going now? On vacation, Jake answered hesitantly. If you could say it was an exile. Anyway, it's a long story. I'm in no hurry to go anywhere. So tell me what's going on, John said, and made himself comfortable, intending to pass the time listening to someone else's story. Well, where to start? Probably with the fact that I was given a condition, either to be investigated and at best get a suspended sentence, which, in fact, does not make it any easier, or go to the middle of nowhere but with an unblemished reputation and the opportunity to practice medicine. Next, who exiled you? Made you an offer you can't refuse. Her chief medical officer, to cover up the unpleasant story about the missing narcotic painkillers, Jake explained. So it wasn't your fault? John Smith asked. Of course not, Jake said indignantly and continued. I was on duty that night. There were a lot of late-night calls, an emergency room. In short, it was a hot night. I had to turn around, keep the nurses moving. In general, I was forced to be on duty more often than others, motivated by the fact that I have higher qualifications and more extensive knowledge. This, of course, was not to my fiancé Ashley's liking. I could understand her. No fiancé, no money. The salary, to put it mildly, doesn't match the qualifications. But the doctor in charge wasn't going to give me any raises. So we got a patient with a gunshot wound to the chest. It's a case right in my specialty, so I'm in the OR prepping for surgery. And then Kyle, my fellow student and colleague, comes running up. I forgot to sign out for narcotics. I also asked him if it was okay, since I had indicated that I had only spent 2 ampoules of painkillers. He replied that the quantity of drugs in the report matched. So I signed the document purely on trust. I've known each other for so many years, and then it turned out that 1 ampoule was missing. That's how your friend counted the last of the medicine, said John Smith. That's on him, Jake said. That's what I told the head doctor. Only I was the one under suspicion, and I signed it. And Kyle said he hadn't seen anything and didn't. So there you go. And to keep the story quiet, the chief decided to fire me from the clinic and move me to a no-go village. He didn't want any publicity, especially since our hospital is considered a model hospital. His head would have exploded. Am I the only one who has no idea where the damn ampoule went? I mean, everything was there. And I'll tell you where, squinted the traveling companion, who began to like this young doctor. Just tell me, my hearty friend, weren't you afraid that this Kyle of yours was saving up evil for you? To be honest, he was, Jake admitted. At first, he was jealous of me because I'd had an easier time studying to be a doctor. Then he'd taken offense when I'd been assigned to a clinic in the capital, but his rich father had gotten him a job in our department by any means necessary. Again, he did not like and bitter that I was promoted to the head of the department. Or rather, I used to be, and patients were more likely to see me than him. What are you implying? How old are you? Naive, like little children. Ye, laughed John Smith. Now tell me, who's going to be the head of the department now? There's no one else but Kyle, Jake answered quickly. He slapped himself on the forehead. That's it? I didn't realize. So you're saying Kyle set me up, cleared a spot for himself, maybe for something else? We'll have to weigh it all out. He hesitated. Let's talk, you'll remember something else. Let's see what the landlady put me with. Cookies, ruddy chickens, potatoes, meat and cottage cheese pies, smoked sausage, fresh cucumbers, tomatoes, a muffin, cookies, and a 3-liter jar of compote magically appeared on the table. Wow, Jake exclaimed. I'm drooling like it's New Year's Eve. Well, the laughter started, said John Smith. There's no telling what the occupation will be like in the town you're going to. It's all a side effect of 30 years of living together with a wife. So go ahead and get a wife, he said with his mouth full. I'd love to get married, but there's no one to marry.
How come? Wondered the neighbor.
My fiancé left me when I was fired from a prestigious clinic. Said it was out of the way with a loser. And 2 weeks ago, we applied for the registry office. Do you know how frustrating that is? For better or for worse, as they say. Why do you need such a wife who will run away at any problem? Anyone can change in wealth. Try to live when there's only bread and water on the table. That's you, my friend. We have a lot of things now, that's why they're coming. We used to live well, but we helped each other. Raised 3 sons, brought up good people. You too will find a kind, brave wife, with whom you will go into fire and water together. Look, don't lose her. Yes, I think you're right. I was worried for nothing, Jake agreed after the men had refreshed themselves. They continued their conversation in the vestibule, where John Smith was smoking a pipe. Say, Jake, did you do anything to provoke this Kyle guy's anger? He asked, squinting his eyes. It appeared that he was beginning to look like Sherlock Holmes. Yeah, there was a case, Jake remembered. I cured a difficult patient of his. I don't understand your humor. What's wrong with that? The interlocutor wondered. What's wrong is that you shook his authority. Without thinking of the consequences, interfered too rudely with the course of treatment. Burst in, you might say, saw that the patient is injected with drugs from which he could be paralyzed, and scolded a nurse who had nothing to do with it. I couldn't imagine Kyle being that unprofessional. The nurse messed up. Then I had to apologize to her. And then Kyle didn't forgive me for calling him a mediocre doctor in front of everyone. I mean, really, I should have kept quiet if he wouldn't listen to me any other way. And what did the head doctor say when you were arguing? John Smith asked. Oh no, he took a neutral position, replied Jake. Then I found out something interesting. It turns out the patient was a very wealthy man. A nurse told me before I left that that rich man already had a will drawn up in favor of his young wife. While he was in the hospital, she went to nightclubs and told everyone that she would soon become a rich widow and then fly to the Maldives. But I completely changed his treatment regimen, and the man got out of the vicious cycle Kyle had him in. You know, it turns out I unwittingly messed up the plans of my wife, who often visited me in the hospital. Guess who? Well, already, of course, John Smith replied.
No, she hasn't. She was visiting Kyle. That's what my co-workers told me later too, Jake said.
That's where it all went from there. But what else is there to tell? This couple, they say they went to restaurants together, the doctor continued. That's their business. Don't you think, dear friend, that this is the truest conspiracy of all? John Smith, and I killed a bet that you were the one who was framed for pulling Pokrovsky out of the dead, breaking all the plans of the failed Widow Tower and her accomplice. And it was your buddy Kyle who did it. That can't be right. It never even occurred to me. It did, Jake replied. Or was he shocked at his compartment mate's conclusion? What had to happen for someone who took an oath to be a doctor to deliberately extinguish the life of someone who put his trust in him? That's real murder. What a scoundrel. What now? John Smith sighed. It seems that it can't be undone. There's no turning back the clock. Try to justify yourself in the new place. After all, in the village live people who deserve such a talented doctor like you. Thank you for your kind words. It's important now, Jake Wilson replied gratefully. After that conversation, it was as if a stone had fallen from his soul. He was ready for a new life and was not afraid of change. Leopardly, in the morning the train made a brief stop at the Little Essie station. It was time to say goodbye to John Smith. Hold on. John Smith gave him a fatherly hug, and I think there are a lot of good people out there. Thanks for the kind words, Jake replied and smiled. Lucky to have met you along the way. Are we going to be long? 2 minutes, the conductor shouted. Jake stepped off the train. He turned and waved. Now he was turning over a new leaf. The station was green and bathed in the first rays of sunlight. Jake took a deep breath of the air. It was sweet and scented with flowers. Suddenly he felt happy, as if in an old movie. A young promising doctor comes to the countryside and faces the hardships of life and the intricacies of fate. Jake exclaimed at the top of his voice and strode toward the small building with a sign that read Alessia Station. There was a big barn lock on the door, however. Where to go next? He didn't know, and so he sat down on a bench to wait for the ticket booth worker. Don't wait, you won't, came a voice from somewhere. It's a day off. It's Saturday. Jake turned around. Behind him stood a small grandfather with a bushy beard, smoking. A cloud of smoke hovered around his head, but it didn't bother the stranger. Horace, I've never compared anyone from the train to you. That's funny. Visitor, Grandpa asked. No, just me, Jake answered.
And here's the unfortunate thing, the doctor who was assigned to us from Chicago was upset. It was a waste of a horse, wasn't it?
Why not? I'll go with you, said Jake. Well, that's understandable, Grandpa sighed. I don't ask you, you'll have the tea. What's your... Wilson, Jake answered, and he felt funny at his grandfather's talk and smiled. Was there a doctor coming to see you? They say she was kicked out of Chicago for something. So they sent her to us. Our women are afraid to go to her now. They say she'll heal them to death. And they say they won't let them in until they're crying. Maybe it's good that she didn't come. A doctor, but to hell with her. We ain't got no Wilsons. But we will now, Jake laughed. Why, Grandfather? Is there a paramedic station in your village? It doesn't work, said Grandfather. And there's a nurse working in it. What a good girl. She manages to do everything and milk a cow and give someone an injection. Our doctors ran away from us. Only her heels were shining. I have no he says. I immediately galloped to town and got married there. Desperate. You know how I'm called Grandpa Fedor, so call me Grandpa Fedor. I see. I'm Jake Wilson. The staff at the hospital called me Jake. So I'm going to be working here with your little sister. What's her middle name? And I don't have a case. Makarovna. Grandpa Fyodor was taken aback. So you're our new doctor. You're a woman. That's what. Have the women lied again? I've made a mistake in front of you, Jake. I'm sorry. That's all right, Jake said. Now let's go to your hospital to see her right away. Grandpa Fyodor realized. Come on, let's go home. And the old horse, with its head down, started off easily, pulling a small wagon with 2 riders behind it. Jake had never ridden a cart before, and so he watched curiously and listened to the singing of the forest birds. Gradually, a drowsiness overcame him.
Jake! Wake up, Grandfather Fyodor shouted to the horse, and the horse obediently got up. Wake up, Jake.
Here we are. Jake Wilson opened his eyes and was surprised to see a small house with 3 windows. It was the nurse's station of the small town of Upwood. Behind the house was a small vegetable garden. Here's your work, here's your home, the old man said in a low voice. Look who's here. The 2 front doors are for the hospital, and back there are old doors. You'll go to hut there too. Thank you, Grandpa. Thank Jake. How far is the store? Do you need to buy some groceries? Who buys groceries? The old man was surprised. Do they? People have nowhere to put their money. There's a well, as much as you want. Our water is clean and the store is across the street." "How am I supposed to get in?" Jake asked. "There's a key on the door jamb," said Grandfather John Smith. "And so would your father. I live on that hill over there. What'll it be, Jake?" "All right," said Jake, and went first into the house to put his things away. The doctor's quarters were small. It consisted of one room and a small kitchenette with a few simple utensils. There was just enough to live on and nothing extra. That's how they lived in the village. The length of the news that a young doctor from New York had come to visit them traveled with the speed of light. In half an hour, the locals started coming to the medical station. Some were carrying potatoes, some homemade sausage, some milk and sour cream, some baked goods, or eggs in a basket. Everyone wanted to get acquainted with the new doctor, in whose hands their health and lives would be from this day on. "Oh, what a young man," was heard from the crowd that gathered behind the fence of the medical station and watched the new doctor wash himself from the hand basin. "Why are you standing in the street? Hello?" An elderly woman came out ahead of the city. "We have come to say hello to the new man. My name is Granny. And you, Jake?"
Jake wiped his hands with a towel and stared in surprise at the crowd.
"Good afternoon. My name is Jake Wilson. I'm a cardiac surgeon. I was sent here from the capital to help you. Come in, be my guest." The women smiled and were pleased with the welcome. They came in and peered into the dwelling. Jake watched and marveled at the way these people went about their business. Some began to make their beds, others scrubbed the floors, and still others stoked the stove and began to cook the chowder in a cast iron, sticking it in the stove. The aroma wafted through the house, making Jake's mouth water. And the chowder was so good that no restaurant could compare. By evening, everyone had gone, leaving Jake alone. Now he could think it was going to be difficult. My mind was racing with thoughts of how much I'd have to learn. I don't even know how to make a stove. What's the point of having one in the city? Although, how am I supposed to cook food? I'll have to buy an electric stove. And in the winter, I'll learn, Jake thought. His thoughts were interrupted by a cautious knock at the door. "Come in, it's open," he said. The door opened, and a pretty girl of about 25 came in. She didn't come empty-handed either, but brought a basket of pies. "Good evening, Dr. Wilson. And I'm Mary, the nurse. Everyone knows me here," she smiled.
Jake immediately remembered the words of John Smith's grandfather.
"Nice to meet you, Mary. Then we'll work together. Come on in. I'll manage the samovar over tea and conversation." The time passed quickly. It's long gone dark outside the window. "But I've got to go," Mary said. "We've been talking too much. I'll see you on Monday. Why don't I walk you home?" "It's kind of like this. Who's going to hurt me? Everyone here is a friend," she laughed. "This isn't the city." Jake wanted to go for a walk, so he volunteered to take her home. It was warm outside, smelling of fresh leaves. He felt like he was in a fairy tale world, or even a dream. Jake noticed that Mary was looking at him with a fondness that meant sympathy on her part, but he could offer nothing in return, for his heart still ached at his fiancé's betrayal. For Mary herself, the new doctor was a dream come true. She couldn't find a better match. Besides, he was a handsome, intelligent young man, which also meant a lot. She'd seen how respectful people talked about Jake, and it made her proud. She wanted to be a part of that too, and so a simple plan to marry the doctor to herself as soon as possible had matured in the practical nurse's mind. After Jake saw her off, he stood for a while on the bank of the river that ran nearby. The village was asleep and only one house had a glimmering light. It was Grandpa Frank's insomnia. This Monday morning brought Jake back to reality. Before the sun had even risen, he was awakened by the roosters preparing to go out on his first day of work in the settlement. He heard some grumbling. It turned out there was already a line lined up for the station, which in addition served as a gathering place for gossiping women to scratch their tongues. Upon seeing the doctor in a strict suit, the line suddenly fell into respectful silence. Everyone stared at the new guy. "Good morning," Jake greeted everyone, one at a time. "Hello" came from everywhere. But 10 minutes later, there was a scuffle in the crowd. Somebody wanted to jump the line.
He even had to go out and call for order, because no one was going to listen to Mary. It turned out to be a lot of work. The habitual company of teenagers was extremely neglected, and most of them had not had a fluorography for years. In addition, dispensary for a long time, no one has not been engaged in.
What was the last doctor doing here? Jake resented him. Why is the file cabinet in such bad shape? Mary, you can do whatever you want, but all the data must be entered into an electronic database so that the doctors in the region can see the patient's medical history. Do you understand? Otherwise, we're going to have a fight on our hands. I understand, Jake. Mary smiled. You made me sound like we've been married for 10 years. Well, I'm sorry, Jake said. For some reason, some doctors think that if they work in the countryside, they can be negligent about their work and their patients and not keep up with the times. I know a lot of well-known experienced doctors who are still studying. So far, they have graduated from various courses and studied new scientific achievements. But don't rural people deserve quality treatment, worse than urban people? An elderly woman, who was at the reception at that moment, looked at the new specialist with inspiration and absorbed his every word. You know what Elizabeth said in line when she left the office? The new doctor has for us, ordinary people, hurts with all his soul worries. And he's so young, but he's talking. Oh, how he started to point out our little irregularities, saying that something was wrong, came from the queue. And the villagers were convinced that Jake was the best doctor in the world. And he'd been sent here for the truth. The week flew by, and Jake was fully immersed in his work, not noticing how the cat was changing the evening. The lines were getting shorter, the house calls fewer. It was time to plant gardens. So people's ailments receded into the background. One evening late already, in the door of the house, someone hesitantly knocked.
Who's come through the door in this rainstorm? Jake thought grudgingly, but then he remembered that there wasn't a single doctor for 20 kilometers around. So he pulled himself together. It was his profession. He chose it.
Jake opened the door. A stranger stood before him, drenched to the skin. She was sobbing. He couldn't tell if she was crying or if it was the rain streaming down her face on the floor, carefully woven and presented by Elizabeth's grandmother. The guest stood on the threshold and was silent. The master of the house was silent as well. I am sorry to disturb you at this hour, she began with a trembling voice. But it's a matter of life and death. Jake realized she was crying and motioned for her to come in. Who are you? He asked. My name is Carrie, she said. I came here unnoticed, or they'll gossip. Ours can throw stones, and there is enough shame. Carrie cried again, and Jake handed her a handkerchief. She frantically crumpled it in her hands. Jake realized that this was a serious matter. We're not in the office, so I suggest we talk informally as friends, Jake said. Okay, Carrie agreed.
Jake handed her his robe.
I'll go to the kitchen and make some tea because you're soaking wet. It's still chilly in the house. I didn't heat the stove today. While he was in the kitchen, Carrie rolled up her wet clothes and put on her robe, which of course was too big. She looked comical in Jake's clothes and he smiled. Here, help yourself. There's cookies and candy and meat pies Grandma Elizabeth baked, and then we'll talk, okay? Carrie nodded and smiled, her pearly teeth showing, a smile that suited her well. Jake watched her absently over his tea. He looked around wearily. Do you work somewhere? Jake asked. Yes, I work on a farm as a milkmaid. I actually studied to be a veterinarian. I love animals. I'm waiting for our vet to retire and they'll hire me to take his place. Everything is going so well and you're crying. What's wrong? He said. The thing is, the son of the farmer I work for now cheated me, Carrie said with her head down. He promised to marry me. When I told him I was pregnant, he told me to get rid of the baby and keep quiet. And he's not going to help with the baby and recognize it as his own either, she said dryly. So I'm not going to get rid of the baby, Carrie said. It's just that there's no one else to ask for help. You're kind of the authority figure around here. Why don't you talk to Mike Brown, my baby's father? Maybe he'll listen to you, change his mind. I got a sick mom. That's why I'm working in her place, so I can make a living. And when the baby comes, I'll have to leave the farm. We won't have enough compensation for the three of us. So what do we do? I don't know how I fell for that bastard's tricks. It was like a blur. He's always disgusted me, and now it's as if I've lost my will. And he's never been lovely, like some kind of intoxication, Jake said thoughtfully. That remains to be seen. So wait, what about your mom? He wondered.
Heart's weak, Carrie replied. Constant dizziness, weakness. She was in the hospital in town, but the doctors said they couldn't help her. Prescribed some pills for heart palpitations. They sent her away, and they don't give her disability.
You could lie down and die, Jake said. So tomorrow morning, bring your mother to my office. We'll do a cardiogram, get her looked at. Send tests to the city, Jake suggested, with the baby. Maybe I can help you if the dad doesn't come to his senses. You gotta fight for your happiness. You understand, don't you? Carrie smiled. I understand, thanks. I feel better now. It stopped raining and she left, asking not to be escorted out lest she started gossiping. Jake lived, fighting the stress, went to bed. Needed to build up his strength. It was going to be a tough day. Carrie brought her mom. Linda Johnson was pale and could barely move on her feet. There was no one around this morning, so Jake was able to get a good look at the patient and do the tests that were available to him. When he found out what Carrie's mother had been treated with, he was indignant. The regimen is totally wrong for you, Linda. Is that why you feel so bad? These drugs seem to have been prescribed at random without the proper tests. So here's what we're going to do. You're going to remove all the medications and stay on bed rest for a week, and I'll prescribe you some drops. They're inexpensive. You take them for now, and when the results come back, I'll prescribe you something else. It's not that bad. We'll see. Maybe you'll be able to go to work soon. It's just the effects of age-related changes, and your body wasn't ready for it. That's why it reacted so violently, Jake explained. Mother and daughter looked at each other. They both had tears in their eyes. You could see how worried and anguished they had been all this time over some medical malpractice that had nearly driven a nearly healthy woman to her grave. Doctor, yes, next to you. I even feel better somehow, Linda exclaimed. I was really going to die. Her tears streamed from her eyes. Carrie looked at her mom and burst into tears. She hadn't told her mom she was pregnant yet, afraid of giving her a heart attack. I realized this and decided to help. So that's it then, he declared. In 6 months, you can safely work as a milkmaid or a nurse and there and babysit a grandson. The time will come. What do you mean, a grandchild? Rounded Linda's eyes. Mom, I'm pregnant with Mike Brown's baby, and he doesn't want one. Carrie lowered her head. Her mother's face frowned, but then suddenly brightened. Well, screw him. I'll be on my feet soon enough. We'll raise a granddaughter someday. All thanks to our golden man, Jake Wilson. If your father were alive, he'd give that Brown guy a hard time, Linda said through her tears, winking off into the distance. Carrie came out without a limp. It was like she'd been given a new lease on life. That's what moral support means, Jake said. It's important to patients. I don't know how to thank you. I shook Carrie's hand. I was so scared for my mom, and I was scared she'd find out about my situation. It's embarrassing. I'm not married, and now that she's cheered me up so much, I can't be bothered. Oh, how nice of you to come to us. Carrie gave Jake a big hug out of sheer exuberance. He could feel her heart beating. Something fleeting, tender touched his soul. It was like falling in love. And even though this girl was nothing like his sophisticated ex-fiancé, she doesn't play the piano or wear beautiful clothes. But in all of that, you can see her bright soul. I don't expect anything in return. When Carrie was leaving, or I was still watching for a long time, if he didn't understand, Mike, how could you offend such an angel? Farmer Brown's house was a real mansion. When I walked into the backyard, I saw that the owner's family had servants in addition. It was all in the style of a manor house. Some women and men either carrying something or washing and cleaning. So rich, I thought truthfully. Linda Johnson said on the steps of the mansion sat a young, full-bodied man with sideburns, Mike Brown with the same hair and the same eyebrows. His small eyes were watching the laborers. He looked more like an angry pig. Afternoon. Is that you, Mike? Jake asked. I'll take care of you, doctor. His eyes jumped before he showed up. We don't have any sick people. I'm here about Carrie's situation. She said you got her pregnant. She wants to keep the baby, and it turns out you're against it. What's the matter? You can't handle your own baby. That's none of your business, doctor. Mike stood up to his full height, revealing a decent beer belly. Not really my thing. If she's pregnant, I'm the only doctor in the area. So you don't recognize the baby too. Jake didn't want to deal with that unscrupulous bastard anymore. Right off the bat, Mike chuckled. Vaughn would be happy to marry me with the kind of money our family has. It's a dream come true for them. We're not talking about marriage now, but about responsibility for the baby, Jake said. Will you admit paternity? No, I've already said it. Whoever she complains to is the one who's going to feed her now. Okay, Jake said. He turned and walked away. He realized he had nothing more to say to this man. Lunch was coming to an end, and he hurried to the nurse's station. It was Children's Day, so there were moms and babies gathered in the hallway. Mary was already hard at work, weighing, measuring height, and handing out preventive immunization handouts to moms. "Well done, Mary. You're doing a great job." Jake praised the nurse. Why were her cheeks flushed? Scarlet? She looked coquettishly at the doctor and smiled at him as if she had the face of a mature beauty. The Marys in the line were whispering about her and Jake's relationship, and there was a need to spread the rumor that the new doctor in town and the local nurse weren't just colleagues. Jake Wilson didn't notice the intrigues and love nets that the girl was carefully setting up. He plunged headlong into his work. In the evening, when he stoked the stove and cooked soup himself according to the recipe of a local resident, Carrie came to visit him. "I'm sorry I didn't knock," she said, and cried. "What's wrong with you and Mom? Is something bothering you?" Jake asked. "I got fired." Sobs. "Carrie came to the farm today. And Mike told me and Mom not to go in their barn. I got my paychecks, my workbook. How are we going to live now?" "All right, you'll live. You can't stop crying." Jake started to calm her down. "Everything's going to be all right. That bastard Brown can't wait to humiliate you. I've been needing a custodian and a cleaner for a long time. That's 2 full-time jobs. I think you and Linda Johnson are good enough. We'll get you signed up tomorrow. While your mom can't work, I'll give her sick leave. You'll do the cleaning for her, and I'll help out, of course. Mary's been working too hard. Those nurses work too hard at their jobs." Carrie stopped crying, wiped her tears, and smiled radiantly. "Really? Are you going to help us? Are we going to have everything like people?" "Of course," Jake confirmed. "Don't forget to bring your mom to the reception." In front of you, Carrie ran out of the room. She couldn't wait to tell her mother the good news. She was elated. That's how simple words of encouragement and a little help can lift a fallen person. Jake Wilson knew this well because he was a good. What can't be said about Mike Brown, who, upon learning that Jake had helped Carrie's family, held a grudge against him. The treatment Jake prescribed for Carrie's mom, according to research, worked great. After 2 months, she was able to get off sick leave and work at the nursing station with her daughter. As Carrie's belly grew, the hopes of the township matchmakers to marry her dwindled by the day. Mary saw from the sidelines how tenderly Jake looked at Carrie, and his feelings were mutual. Linda Johnson surrounded the doctor with care, gratitude, and simply because this John Smith, as she called him behind her eyes, was to her liking. Soon, everyone in the township found out that Carrie was pregnant, but they didn't know by whom. Everyone who knew about it was silent as a partisan. So the local women wondered who the mysterious father was. Rarely any decent girl gets involved with anyone, reasoned one of them, standing in the village. Then why doesn't she marry? "AI?" questioned another. "Is it the doctor's fault?" asked an old woman. This aroused the anger of the crowd. "What are you talking about, Semyonovna? The doctor is a good fellow. He wouldn't dishonor a girl. And look, with your chick in mind, she's got a lot of time on her hands. And Jake Wilson came here only 3 months ago," explained the forester's wife. "And it's true," said Semyonovna. "I almost gave the fellow a bad name. Then he's married." "That's right," Zana concluded. Everyone fell silent at once. Each of them had a husband or a son-in-law. The silence was broken by the forester's wife. "Here you aren't, stupid garden head. You're having second thoughts again. Carrie wouldn't get involved with just anyone. It's someone who tricked her, who messed her up. I guess they did. If I find out who, I'll break his windows. It's becoming a fashion for him to hurt orphans. I was my father Ivan's friend once. We must help the girl." The next day, the women from the village came to Carrie's house and moved what they could. Some brought a crib in which all the children had grown up, some a high chair, some a children's table, and some clothes for the babies. They even brought a tricycle and a soccer ball. That really touched Linda Johnson. It turned out to be a whole holiday with songs and sitting till night. Autumn crept up unnoticed. While harvesting carrots in the vegetable garden, Carrie went into labor. She was rushed to a nearby maternity hospital in the district center. Carrie gave birth to a baby boy, whom she named after her father, Alexander. "Daddy, here's your baby boy," the midwife said as she brought him out for discharge. "He's just like his father, your baby. He looks just like him." Jake looked back at Linda Johnson, who was blushing like a beet. The two of them had come to pick up Carrie together. They'd mistaken him for the baby's father. "Thank you," Jake said, and held out his hands to take the envelope. Little Alexander showed, with a loud cry, that he was no stranger to the world. It wasn't until Carrie got the doctor's note and held his son in her arms that he calmed down. "That's quite a voice," Jake smiled. "He'll probably be an opera singer." Linda Johnson couldn't get enough of her grandson. She took the baby from Carrie, who was still weak and holding the package. "I'm afraid he'll tear up and sing," she said quietly. "I have a proposition for you," Jake said to Carrie. "Why don't you and I register? I'm suggesting it because we like each other, and the most important thing is Alexander's well-being. He can have his father's last name like everyone else." "But it's not your child," Carrie said, surprised. "Wouldn't you regret it? I've liked you for a long time, but I don't want to ruin your life." "No one's saying you're going to ruin my life," Jake said. "Well, do you agree?" "I do," Carrie said shortly. Sobs came from behind them. It was Linda Johnson. The long months of worrying about her daughter were finally over. She was happy, and maybe even happier than the future couple. Like the registry office, they were signed quickly, without delay. And now no one in the village doubted that Alexander was Jake's son. Just born prematurely, that was the rumor among the locals. The newlyweds didn't deny or confirm anything, but just smiled, enjoying their happiness. Everyone was invited to the party to celebrate the creation of a new family. The tables were set right on the meadow. Next, the warm woman's fall still allowed to celebrate until morning. The only two who didn't show up were Mary and Mike. Envy of other people's happiness blinded their eyes. What did drunk Mike say as he passed Mary's house? "Your Jake didn't marry you," he sneered. "I needed my pretty girl, you see." "He's my boy too," Mary said. "He didn't leave me for nothing." "Why didn't you marry me then?" "I wanted to. What if I'd yelled? Then Jake and I had a good chance." "He's just a fool." Mary wouldn't stop. "Don't scold me," Mike snapped at her. I have a plan for revenge. You want to help? Well," and he fell down on the grass with his mouth shut. 3 days later, a prosecutor's audit came to Kashira. I was shocked when I found out what Jake was accused of. "We've received a signal that you, Dr. Wilson, are taking bribes from patients," the investigator said. "Please open the safe." Larry obligingly handed over the keys. When Jake opened the safe, he found a wad of money. Mary secretly rejoiced, for she had put it there at Mike's request, carefully erasing the fingerprints. All the bills were marked with the word bribe, which showed up under a special lamp. "It's not mine," Jake said in shock. "Then whose is it?" the investigator asked. "You were in charge of the safe, and we know about your history with the missing painkillers. That's why you were sent here. What do you—" "I didn't take anything then either," Jake said. "That's what they all say," the investigator grinned. "Shall we make an arrest?" Jake was taken to the city and put in the detention center. Carrie went to see him with packages and told him that no one in the village believed he was guilty. People raised money for a lawyer, but he didn't help either. The court found Jake guilty of bribery, taking into account the past missing drugs. He was eventually sentenced to 4 years. It all happened so fast, they didn't even get a chance to say goodbye. Jake was shipped 1,000 kilometers from home, and Carrie was left with her mother and baby in her arms. The general security colony in Magadan was considered exemplary, but only on paper. When Jake entered the cell, he immediately realized that he would not be allowed to serve a normal sentence here. No sooner had the iron door closed behind him than a small, nasty-looking convict jumped up to Jake. "What kind of bird has flown in?" He chuckled, showing his toothless mouth. Jake silently put his things down on the empty bunk and sat staring at a single point. "They don't teach you how to say hello," another convict said loudly, cleaning something at the table. "Hello, sorry. I'm sorry. I'm very tired after the long trip," Jake replied. "There are rules you can't break," said an older man in an expensive tracksuit that made him stand out from the rest of the prisoners. Everyone was quiet when he spoke. "I don't know the rules yet, so I'll have to learn," Jake said. "Unfortunately, you should have learned sooner. Now, I'm sorry, the locals have taken offense," the man in the suit said. "I'll start over. My name is Jake. What's yours?" There was laughter in the cell, and someone in the corner whistled. "It's not proper to ask such questions of newcomers here," the man said with restraint. And then the doctor realized that he was the chief of the colony. so he kept silent. "You can see the doctor right away," commented the toothless man. "Will he live with us, or will he go to his grave by himself?" "I don't know anything," Jake said tiredly. He was fast asleep. When he woke up, he found all his things scattered and lying around. "Now go get your stuff, doctor." The red-haired, squint-eyed man hopped around him like a monkey. Everybody laughed. "Whoever scattered my stuff, let him collect it," Jake said, squirming inwardly, but not letting on. He sat down at the table, where crumbs lay on the table, as the convicts prepared for breakfast. Just as Jake sat down, 3 prisoners approached him. One clamped his mouth shut, and 2 of them tried to pinch his arms. "Let's throw him in the toilet," the toothless one yelled frantically. Jake managed to grab a spoon from the table. The military training he hadn't missed at the university was making itself felt. With a swift movement, he threw the redhead over his hip. Then he kicked the toothless one under the breath. He hit the toothless one so hard that he collapsed near the restroom, next to a third man, a large, clumsy man who appeared to be the authority's security guard. Jake grabbed the ambo's throat from behind and put the handle of a spoon to it. "Listen, suit, call your handlers," Jake shouted. "I'm a surgeon, and I can cut this boar up like this. Are you going to barbecue or ask for more?" "So pour tea with the doctor," the leader said calmly. "Let's get acquainted." "The Pacan forbade it," the toothless one moaned. "Let him go for his insolence. He spooned us." "I'll let," quietly answered the older man and narrowed his eyes like a snake. The toothless one poked and crawled away under his bunk. The other prisoner was already pouring tea. Sausage, chocolate candies, and a fruit roll appeared on the table like a tablecloth. "Sit down, surgeon. Let's get acquainted," the authority figure said in a tone that brooked no objection. Jake let go of the ambo, who had a trickle of blood running down his neck, and sat down next to the gray-haired man. There was a murmur, but the gray-haired man raised his hand, and everyone fell silent. "I had a name too, but here they call me Gray." "I call you Surgeon Jake. I'll give up my bunk. The terrorist will sleep across from me now." Some stone-faced man silently gathered up his belongings, rolled up the mattress, and left to take Jake's place. "Your stuff my guys will make up for," Gray said. "We've got doctors sitting here. Tell me, surgeon, how did you get here?" Jake told his whole life, and the men who had robbery and murder to their credit listened with their mouths open. That night, the gray-haired man began to feel sick. He collapsed from the bench, clutching his heart. Jake reacted quickly as the nearest cardiologist was several dozen miles away, and he was entrusted to treat the authority figure. The next day, the gray-haired man was better. Since then, Jake had a life of luxury in prison. He became the authority figure's right-hand man, and Carrie waited and hoped for the best. Linda Johnson had 2 jobs and was the breadwinner for their family. Ashley thanked fate that she had gotten back on her feet in time and cursed the farmer's son for what he had done to Mary. Mary, on the other hand, had quit her job and moved to the city, hiding from the wrath of the people. But trouble doesn't come alone. Little Kyle got sick. His heart was too weak. "Does your son need surgery?" "Not now, but in the near future," said the pediatric cardiologist. "And not every specialist will do it." "So what do we do?" Carrie pleaded. "I'll put Kyle on maintenance therapy, but the drugs would be expensive," the doctor said. When Carrie found out how much the drugs cost, she burst into tears. She'd never seen money like that before. God. Linda Johnson splashed her hands when her daughter told her what the doctor had said and that there was no one to help us. "Jake's in jail." And that evening, the state prison called. "We regret to inform you, Mrs. Wilson, that your husband, Jake Wilson, has been killed in a logging camp. He was crushed to death by a log." "We're sorry for your loss," the other end of the line said, and hung up. Carrie felt the ground slipping from under her feet. The light faded in her eyes. No sooner had she been a wife than she was a widow. Linda Johnson was especially grieving. Jake was like a son to her. The rumor that Carrie's son was seriously ill when her husband had died in prison reached Mike Brown. One night there was a knock on the door of Carrie's house. Mike stood on the doorstep, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I'm not made of stone either," he said. "I know people grumble at me saying I need more. I don't have to live on nothing. Come into my house and I'll recognize you as Wilson. I'll help you with your treatment. Why don't you say something? Think about it. You'll pay your debts. If you live with me, I'll give you money for your medicine. And if you don't, I'm sorry." Mike left, and Carrie cried all night. She didn't want anything to do with the hated farmer's son, but the child's life was more precious. "Daughter, don't go. People will help and cure Kyle," her mother begged her. "We can't get that much money and he's rich." "Let them help cure their grandson," Carrie said. "Nothing comes easy. I'm sorry, Mom, but I agree. I can't bring Jake back anyway. At least it'll save my son." Linda Johnson was silent. There was only one person who didn't believe in death, and that was Mary. She filed a request on behalf of Carrie's wife, where she learned that it wasn't him who had died, but his full namesake and his insidious jealousy. A plan matured. She wrote a letter to Jake, telling him in color that his wife had gone to live with Mike, and she kept quiet about her son's illness. "Why are you being so quiet?" the gray-haired man asked Jake, who was holding the unfortunate letter. "Eventually I have to go home." Jake answered briefly and showed Mary's letter to the boss. "Well, that's the way it should be," the gray-haired man replied. "In 3 days, there will be an escape. You can go with them, and I'll cover you. And if they catch you, they'll bring you back to my cell." "I'll make a deal," the gray-haired man assured him. Jake lay awake. He wondered how Carrie could do this to him. The convicts were running at night. The gray man had it all figured out. A freight train loaded with food arrived right on schedule. Some man was waiting for them. He helped them get into the carriage, which was equipped for 4 people. How much it cost the 7th, we could only guess. But in 3 days, the fugitives, led by Jake, were in his village. "Let's rob a store," the redhead suggested. "We'll just kill the clerk, or she'll give us away." "We won't kill anybody, and we won't rob anybody," Jake objected. "Go on your way. I'm going home." But the convicts wouldn't listen. It was their old habits to enter the store at lunchtime, not to scare Zoya, the saleswoman, to death. But they didn't have time to hurt her. "Run!" Jake shouted, and he rushed at the bandits, 2 of whom he managed to disarm, but the 3rd crept up behind him and hit him on the head. If it hadn't been for the men Zoya had brought with her, Jake would have died. "Look, Jake's alive," shouting all around. Carrie ran to the screams, but she didn't get to see her beloved. One thing made her heart glad that Jake was alive, but she was ashamed of him and of people. The thought of the sick child, however, kept her from leaving Mike Brown. As the gray-haired man had said, Jake was returned to the colony, who would be in the cell. But not only did they not add time for escape, but after a year they released him on parole for good behavior. "For me," said the gray-haired man in parting, Jake was finally free and breathing the fresh summer air. When he got back to town, the first thing he did was go to the truck stop. "What are you doing here? Don't mess with us. We'll get out of here. I'm selling the farm. How are you going to leave? You have my wife and son." Jake pushed Mike away and headed toward the house. "Let's go home. It's not your fault." When Carrie saw Jake, she grabbed her son and ran out of the house like she was barefoot. He hugged them, and then he turned around and punched Mike Brown in the face. He fell and couldn't get up for a long time, and Linda Johnson came running toward them. "Jake, you're back." "Oh, Carrie, I was held hostage by that asshole. Sashinka's sick. His heart's weak." Jake looked at Carrie. She said, "I lived like a servant. I didn't cheat on you, I believe you," Jake said. "Let's go home." And outside Carrie's house, the whole village had gathered. People were coming, carrying treats, congratulating Jake on his return. Jake's arrival party was a village-wide celebration. A week later, Notary John Smith arrived. "I've come to transfer Mike Brown's former farm to you." "How's that?" Jake didn't understand. "It's being given to you." "By whom?" "Vladimir Pokrovsky. Remember him? You saved him in New York when you worked at the clinic? By the way, Kyle, who set you up with the missing drugs, is serving time for trafficking in illegal substances, and your grandfather is the handiwork of the same Pokrovsky. So take possession of the farm." "Sure," Jake smiled. And 6 months later, his enterprise was one of the most profitable in the region. The workers on it were making decent wages. Carrie became the head veterinarian, and the whole farm was skillfully managed by Linda Johnson. Sasha was operated on in the best clinic in the capital, and he ran with all the children and no longer choked. Jake succeeded in getting a full-fledged hospital with a hospital and a maternity ward built in the village. Jake Wilson became a hero to the entire female population. The older men called him our Jake. They always guarded the welfare of his family. Mike Brown and Mary, who had returned from the city, were dishonorably banished from the township. In addition, Mike was tried for using illegal drugs. Carrie, on the other hand, was always by Jake's side. One day, Carrie suddenly became dizzy. Jake barely had time to pick her up and was very frightened. "We need to go to the hospital right away," he said. Carrie smiled. "It'll pass. Don't be scared." When Jake asked fearfully, 9 months later, she whispered in his ear, "We're going to have another baby." And time went on in a new way for Jake. How Helen hated sad funeral ceremonies. Well, of course, no one asked her permission to live or go beyond the border, to a place from which no one could return. And now, as soon as she saw the inscription Julia, neighbor on the smartphone screen, her heart sank with an unpleasant feeling. "Helen, hello baby. It's on Julia who worries. Sorry to bring you bad news this morning, but your father's phone isn't answering, so I have to bring grief down on you. George died. I was going to work and saw him sitting in an apple tree. I look, he seems to be doing something," half turning towards the street. Well, I wave to him and say, "Good morning." I ask what he was doing early in the morning, and George showed zero emotion to me, didn't even move. Although you know that my voice is loud, it's impossible not to hear. I went up to George, but he wasn't breathing. While I'm sitting here on the porch, I called all the necessary services, except for the ritual. It's not for me to decide how to see off George, but to be honest, I need to go to work. "Would you come?" Testedly responded in a hoarse voice. "Of course, Aunt Julia. I'm leaving now. I'll be there in 30 minutes. The sad news that her paternal grandfather, the always cheerful and cheerful George, had overcome the last milestone came as a real shock to Helen. We have to go, of course, organize everything, call everyone from grandfather's phone book. However, I wanted to convince myself that this conversation with my neighbor about my grandfather was just a bad dream. Now all you need to do is open your eyelids wide and look at the call history on your smartphone and make sure that there was no call." Unfortunately, this hope was not justified, and there really was a call from Aunt Valia. And the girl did everything possible to quickly get to her grandfather's house, located within the city, but in the so-called private sector. Having already got into the taxi car that had arrived on call, Helen asked her boss for a day off, then had a short conversation with her office colleague, explaining where the documents were, which, as luck would have it, the customers were supposed to come for today. The girl never dared to make the most difficult call. How to inform your father and mother, who have flown away on vacation to celebrate their 25th wedding anniversary, that they urgently need to return to say goodbye to grandfather George. Helen became sad. How unexpectedly this tragedy happened. Just the day before yesterday, she called her grandfather. He said that he was waiting for a visit and asked him to come quickly. Not for the sake of caring for a small garden, but to talk on some issue, to seek it. Helen promised to be there on the weekend that had recently flown by. She could have easily visited her grandfather, but she got a little sick, postponed the visit, called and apologized. They chatted for a bit about nothing. Grandfather George recalled the method that his wife Kristen and grandmother Helen always used. The girl listened that she needed to brew special herbs, wait until the infusion cooled to a pleasant warmth, stir a spoonful of honey in a glass of healing liquid, drink it, and lie down under the blanket. She promised that she would undergo intensive treatment and then visit him. And in the first month of autumn, when she had a vacation scheduled, the girl promised to stay with him for at least a week. Lord, how embarrassing. Now Helen was ashamed that she was going to wait for her vacation. After all, by public transport with transfers, you could get to grandfather in 45 minutes. When there were no traffic jams on the roads, you could even after work go not home, but to a loved one who had been incredibly bored alone for a little over a year. Moreover, it was uneasy that she was a free girl and could easily keep a lonely grandfather company. It would be quite possible to go to work and back by taxi. Of course, it would be more expensive than using public transport, but it would be quick and comfortable. Alternatively, you could simply leave the house a little earlier in order to walk to the transport stop from which the tram of the required route departs. Everything could absolutely be resolved, sorted out somehow. But he didn't have the insight to understand that Grandpa George needed care and supervision, and his requests to come were not just the whim of a bored elderly man. Helen was tormented by a painful feeling of shame, and sighing, she tried to call her parents. However, both Mom and Dad's numbers were out of network coverage. The girl had to send a letter by email, hoping that the unpleasant news would be read not too late. While solving troubles and questions, the time on the way to my grandfather's house flew by unnoticed. Helen got out of the taxi and, listening to Aunt Valia's sympathetic remarks, felt real grief falling on her. The neighbor hugged the girl who arrived, asked her to hold on, and ran to work. Helen looked at her grandfather and kept expecting that now he would get up, stretch, and invite her to a tea party in the house or in the gazebo entwined with grapes. However, no miracle happened. Her services, which arrived in response to a call from a neighbor, began another whirlwind of sad affairs associated with the passing of the older generation. The lady doctor confirmed the death of my grandfather, presumably from a heart attack. She recommended funeral agencies to the girl and explained that there were specialists working there who could organize mourning procedures with the most due respect for the deceased and sympathy for his relatives. Helen listened to the advice and tried with all her might to hold back bitter tears of despair. Only by lunchtime the girl was left alone. Helen entered her grandfather's house and burst into tears when she saw the phone on the table, which he apparently forgot on his last earthly morning. Probably, if he had a cell phone, he would be able to call somewhere and ask for help. But it was impossible to change the past. Everything turned out the way it did. The girl discovered the cash, which her grandfather George and grandmother Kristen told her about shortly after she came of age. The man then tilted the rug hanging over the bed, gently pressed on one of the wooden panels, then with a slight movement moved it to the side. The surprised girl saw a deep vertical niche. Grandfather explained, "Here, granddaughter, Spetta and I are slowly putting money here so that it won't be a burden to anyone. You'll bury us with this money." Helen remembered how she began to grumble at her grandparents. She said that it was too early for them to think about such a topic. She assured that they would still have the opportunity to babysit their great-grandchildren. "No, my dear, that won't do. First, I will have to consider approve, and then help raise the kids. Mom and Dad always have no time." Granny, patting her smiling granddaughter on the head, quietly objected. "Helen, we're not asking you whether it's too early for us to think about our last journey in this world or not. Just showing you so you know, just in case. After all, George already has an anniversary this year, 70 years old, and I'm not much younger. Alas, at that age anything can happen. Your parents, of course, also know about this hiding place. But you never know, maybe they'll be wary or start being modest." Grandfather George supported his wife. "Now, we don't want to be a burden to you. So let's end the conversation." The grandmother hastened to change the topic and began to talk about the amusements of the selected kitten, simply nicknamed the man. Now, 6 years after this conversation, the skinny kid has turned into a well-fed, long, and independent, handsome man. The owner's departure was a real shock for the animal, and he even lost his excellent appetite for several days. However, grandfather George managed to pull the cat out of this state, and now this mission fell to Helen. It seemed to the girl that the orphan cat understood everything, and that's why he curled up on his grandfather's bed and didn't even react to the sound of the refrigerator door opening. The agencies recommended by our employee were indeed professional. A serious man suggested that Helen hold a farewell not at home, but in a special ritual hall at the cemetery. Getting there is much easier than here in the private sector, and even though the house is big, there will still be fuss, unnecessary fuss. The room there is convenient and comfortable. Everyone will be able to say goodbye calmly and without the crush that usually accompanies the removal of a body from an apartment or house. Everything will be both touching and civilized. Besides, understand, it will save you a lot of problems. The offer seemed reasonable to Helen, but she had to spend not only her meager savings but also her grandfather's stash to pay for funeral services. The girl did everything that was necessary. As if being in a state of sleep, she kept waiting for her parents to arrive, or at least answer the email, but in vain. The girl contacted the hotel where they had booked a room, but as we managed to understand from the answer in broken Russian, Mr. and Mrs. Hurd did not move in. They explained that they had decided to change plans a little. Helen was worried about her parents, but she couldn't do anything. Now clods of earth began to fall on the lid of grandfather George's coffin, but neither his son nor his daughter-in-law appeared. Words of condolences and sympathy were received by Helen, who had to listen to the lamentations of distant relatives who came to see the old man off on his last journey. Some spoke bluntly about the thoughtless son and daughter-in-law who did not appear at the mournful event. The girl defended her parents as best she could, and the guardians of other people's morality fell silent for a while. turning the conversation to other topics. Gradually, only relatives and closest neighbors remained at the funeral table, organized in a small cafe. Helen, who last saw most of them a little less than a year ago at farewell to grandmother Sveta, could hardly endure all the questions. She wanted to run away from the cafe as soon as possible, but she had to fulfill her granddaughter's duty to the very end. From time to time, she herself, along with the waiters, took out dirty dishes and brought funeral treats, just so as not to sit at the table listening to the conversations of those gathered growing louder. Quite by chance, Helen, while serving another portion of pies, overheard part of the conversation between Aunt Valia and grandfather's cousin Stepan. George sometimes communicated with this apple tree like a person. I told him, even when Kristen was alive, that this useless tree needs to be cut down. It has long grown higher than the roof of the house, and apples cannot be easily obtained. Kristen, Kingdom of Heaven. She kept swearing that this tree was of little use. It would bear fruit for a year so that you were tired of growing the harvest. Then it wouldn't bear a single fruit. Everything was threatened to be cut down. Only George, blessed to his memory, always stood up to defend the apple tree, nodding, and Julia agreed with the interlocutor. What you say is true. George's passion for this old apple tree also seemed strange to me. Well, if only the plot was about a hectare, then it would seem that the place wouldn't be a problem. But it's simply stupid to leave such a huge tree in such a small snippet of conversation, made Helen think. Indeed, in fact, grandfather treated this apple tree as if it were a living person. The girl often saw him affectionately stroking the bark of a tree as he passed by. Once as a child, Helen, deciding to play, climbed onto a branch, which broke off under her. And grandfather George, entrusting his granddaughter to the care of his wife, began to treat the wound of the tree himself. Recently, after the death of grandmother Kristen, my grandfather even preferred to relax alone under the crown of an apple tree, rather than in a specially built gazebo entwined with grapes. Thoughts from the mysterious apple tree that George had so highlighted briefly receded to sad worries. The relatives were the last to leave the rented hall, and Stepan reminded Helen, no, someone should definitely spend the night in George's house until 40. You won't be scared alone until your parents show up. Maybe send someone with you. At least take Mylena, my youngest daughter, with you. She has nothing to do at home anyway. Her husband is on a business trip. You can sit and chat. Looking at her, she saw the face of a woman who clearly had her own plans for the evening and completely lacked the desire to spend the night somewhere in an unfamiliar place. Helen hastened to refuse. But thank you, but I really can handle it myself. After all, it's like a sign of my respect for my grandfather. Having said goodbye to everyone, the girl hurried to the public transport stop, since her relatives had to go in completely different directions. As soon as Helen opened the gate of her grandfather's house, she regretted that she had tried to create the image of an independent and strong person. Of course, she's not too young to be afraid of an empty house. But I've already spent several nights here completely alone, so he can handle it. She began to think again about the reason why the tree occupied such an important place in the life of her relative. Thoughtfully, the girl hand-fed the sad cat, but she felt somehow uneasy being in the house, even in the company of a cat. Helen went out into the yard and, obeying an impulse, approached a tree on which small green fruits were hanging high somewhere. A flock of goosebumps ran down her spine when the girl saw scratches on the ground. There was no doubt. Grandfather George left these marks. It became truly creepy when Helen had the crazy idea that the dying man was scratching the ground not in agony but trying to dig something up. The girl went to the barn, took a small garden trowel from there, and returning to the apple tree, began to carefully dig the ground. Almost immediately, the scoop hit something hard. Helen began to dig with the utmost care and soon pulled out from a shallow hole a solid rectangular package, wrapped in a bag and additionally wrapped with tape. Helen had never heard any stories about family heirlooms and was truly shocked. At home, Helen laid an old towel on the table, which had long been asking for a well-deserved rest somewhere in the trash, put her find on it, and carefully opened the package with a kitchen knife, which grandfather always kept sharp. Under the layers of tape in the bag was a metal candy box. The girl, holding her breath, opened it and saw inside not jewelry or money but papers. Under the folded notebook leaves, clearly covered with grandmother's even handwriting, there were envelopes. Judging by the fact that the package was quite modern, with the emblem of a chain supermarket, and the paper was neither damp nor yellowed, Helen concluded that the find had not lain in the ground for very long. thinking that nothing bad would happen if she found out what her grandfather was trying to get before his death. Helen began to study the find. It was clearly written by my grandmother. "My dear George, I'm writing you a note, realizing that I have very little time left in this world, and I don't think I have the right to take this secret with me. Forgive me, George, for many years ago, because of love for you, I committed deception and even a crime. It's hard to admit, but it's necessary. You and I were already married then. They sent my daughter to kindergarten, and I returned to work at the post office. Everything was fine with us, so I envied myself. And then I saw a letter addressed to you. The sender was a certain woman. My heart immediately felt bad. I didn't give you the letter. I secretly read it myself. That's how I found out about your novel. Your sweetheart reported that it was her strict father who arranged your separation back in 1964. He threatened to kill you or put you in jail using his connections. In fact, he left her the only way, to tell you, looking into your eyes, that he doesn't love you at all and doesn't want to see you ever again. The mother tried to stand up for her daughter, but it did not help. The woman was simply beaten by her own husband because she dared to say a word in defiance. I looked at what your father had done and was terribly afraid for you. That's why she said convincingly everything she was told. After this cruel confession, you predictably flared up, packed your things, took an apple tree seedling as a souvenir for your parents and returned. The sensible woman in the letter reported that she was pregnant with your child, and to cover up her sin, she was married off without an official signature to some widower with numerous children in a remote settlement that didn't even have a name. I read the letter in the dark, wet with tears, and even began to sympathize with your young beloved. She complained that her family life did not work out. The man with whom she had to live perceived her as a servant. But despite the scandals with relatives, Alina named the girl she was born your daughter in honor of her mother Sophie. The unfortunate young mother found herself literally in slavery. She endured beatings, humiliation, and tirelessly planned her escape. When my daughter began to grow up, Alien became even heavier. The native children of this so-called husband began to mock the girl, and her mother could not say a word in defense. The beatings began immediately. Only 5 years later, Alien still managed to escape from her husband. She did not give details, but because even the letters at this point were blurred from tears spilled on the paper, it was clear. It was very difficult. Alien asked that you come to these very settlements for her and her daughter. She wrote that she would be waiting for you. When I read the letter, it was as if I had gone blind and deaf at the same time. I really didn't understand how I should continue to live. Giving you the messages meant losing my family, and our son was only 3 years old. How could I deprive his father with my own hands? How would he grow up without you? I repent. That first letter, I then destroyed it and threw it in the oven. I thought I protected my family. I shouldn't have hoped. Alien continued to send letters. The next one came almost a year later. Apparently, she planned for you to receive news from her and your daughter on your birthday. She asked why you don't answer her. How scared I was then that she would get ready and come to you. The distance is not particularly long, maybe a little more than 300 kilometers or something like that. It turns out that almost next door to us live those who are capable of destroying my life. If I can burn the letters, then the problem with Sophie is more complicated. What am I supposed to do with the woman and child? I started thinking about how I could prevent them from coming to you. I wrote a letter copying your handwriting on your behalf just in case. I promised that I would come as soon as I could. You probably don't even remember how I tried to persuade you to move, but you never agreed. So I lived like on a volcano. I didn't know how to protect my happiness, how to preserve it if you found out the truth about yours. At work, I also didn't take any vacation or sick leave because of this. Then you realized, 5 years later, that only once a year does this woman bother you. I felt a little better. I burned the letters for a long time, several years, and then I felt ashamed. I started hiding them. I knew that there were places in the house that you would never think of getting into. The only thing is, because of my own fears, I couldn't leave my post office and refused the more promising position. Well, it's okay, I'm used to it. How long did she write to you? But I only saved 10 messages with the last letter that arrived in 1994, and I acted completely meanly, and that she wrote that her health had become completely bad and that she needed medication. And although Sophie tries to support her, there's always not enough money. It's clear. It was such a time then, the whole country was in a fever. She didn't ask for anything for herself. But, of course, I couldn't completely calm down. What if the difficult one brings her to our region? What if she decides to see you? I carefully printed this envelope and returned it with the note the addressee has left. After that, the stream of letters from Alien completely dried up. Why should I have done this before? And I don't understand it myself. There wouldn't be a problem in the first place. And now I don't know what to do with the letters. By right and conscience, you should read them, but not during my lifetime. So, when you find out the bitter story of Ali and your daughter, I will no longer be there. Sorry for being selfish, but I couldn't do otherwise. She loved you too much and didn't want to leave her son without a father. Now I don't care anymore. Gina has also grown up a long time ago, and his granddaughter is a bride. So the path to Alien is clear. I only ask you one thing. Wait at least a year after I leave before looking for your first love and daughter, whom you have never seen. Maintain this period of mourning in honor of all the good things that happened between us. And then do as your heart tells you. Forgive me for everything. Loving you, Kristen. Helen was shocked when she read the note. The story of tragic love, many years of deception, and difficult confession involuntarily touched her. The girl thought that probably Kristen's grandmother should have kept her secret forever. On the other hand, she understood that this was too cowardly. Of course, it's easier to judge from the outside than to find yourself in such a stalemate. And Helen couldn't imagine what she would have done in her grandmother's place. Would you immediately tell your legal husband that his friend still loves him and is waiting for him, together with their common daughter, or would you try by any means within your imagination to protect him from this literally stunning information? It became clear to Helen what Grandpa George wanted to talk to her about. Surely, since the one-year reprieve that Grandmother Kristen asked him for was coming to an end, he wanted to get advice on how to find his old lover. After all, a lot of time has passed, and it is possible that this alien has long since changed the common surname Smith. Her daughter, Helen's blood sister and her father's daughter, could also probably be married. Trying to distract myself from the unexpected information received, Helen put the papers back into the box, put it in the closet, and began reading the letters that Alien had sent to her grandfather. You never know what other details of the personal life of a loved one will be revealed. So alone, except for the cat, she fell into a light sleep. It was boring, and Helen started cleaning, although there was no particular need for this. The girl took out a bucket of dirty water to throw it into the far corner of the site and saw a car drive up to the gate. Helen's parents, who had finally returned from abroad, got out of the car, and she was incredibly happy. Even though this meeting was tinged with bitterness, at least the worry for the parents receded from the heart. During the confused conversation, it turned out that they had arrived in a place where there was no connection or access to the internet. Michael and Anne, having reached civilization, received a sad message from their daughter just before the funeral of Grandfather George and hurried to return, but were still late. Helen was glad that she now had the support she needed so much. After hugs and tears, when everyone was already sitting at the table, the girl began to tell her dad and mom about the unusual find. To prove her words, the girl took out a box from the closet and together with her parents. She once again read aloud Grandma Kristen's handwritten confession, and then they studied the surviving letters. One of them contained a photo from a photo studio. It depicted two pretty girls, and there was clearly a kinship in the appearance of the beauties, but they looked more like sisters with a not very big age difference. However, the inscription on the back of the photograph indicated that this was the first love of Grandfather George and their common daughter Sophie. In beautiful handwriting it was written, "In memory of my beloved George from Alien and Sophie on her 16th birthday. We look forward to meeting you. 1981. Michael, forgetting about his respectability, even whistled, "Yes." To say that I'm surprised is to say nothing at all. How did Mom manage to keep all this a secret for so many years and not give away her knowledge? I can't even imagine. Anne, who had a wonderful relationship with her calm mother-in-law, contrary to all stereotypes and ideas about the peculiarities of the family way of life, was also perplexed. They had so many heart-to-heart conversations, but Kristen never said a word that somewhere far away her official husband had a beloved and illegitimate daughter. It was not easy to come to terms with such news. Anne asked, "Do you think we should find your sister and her mother, if she's still alive, of course, or let everything remain as it is?" The man himself did not know how to react to what was happening. Judging by what he learned from his daughter, the father wanted the secret of his youth to be known. On the other hand, is it ethical now to intrude into the fate of a stranger, but a woman related by blood? She appears to be about 50 years old now, and this same alien is most likely now approaching 70, a reminder of her difficult youth, and the man she once loved so much but never got to see could be harmful to her health. In addition, as Kristen's grandmother wrote, after she sent back the letter marked the addressee has dropped out, they stopped coming at all. This could mean that Alien believed the lie or that she was desperate. However, alas, the most unfavorable events in the fate of the woman and her daughter could have happened, Byrne said, as if voicing her thoughts out loud. But still, it seems to me that we should at least try to find my grandfather's daughter just to somehow rehabilitate him. After all, it's not Grandpa George's fault that everything turned out this way. I think it would be fair if the whole truth became known to Alien, and, of course, Sophie. Listen, Dad. The girl turned to Michael. How do you feel knowing that you have an older blood sister? Do you want to see her and chat? The man was confused and asked his daughter in response. And you, Helen, this is Sophie. Actually, Auntie, that's what you have to do. It turns out that it's interesting to meet her. Helen listened to herself and admitted, curious and a little scary. Her opinions in the family were divided. Anne, after listening to her husband and daughter, said, "It seems to me that we should leave everything as it is. There is no need now to disturb something that has long been forgotten. More than half a century has passed. Maybe this alien is happy with another person. And hello, meet, so to speak, relatives." I think this is not entirely correct. A long conversation did not help find a compromise. In addition, all family members themselves were not sure of the correctness of their thoughts. As a result, the father went to bed in order to visit the place of George's final resting place in the morning. "Sorry, Dad, I'm late," Michael whispered, standing by a fresh mound covered with wreaths. "I never could have imagined that we wouldn't see each other again." The man put 4 scarlet carnations on the empty space and bowed his head, hiding his tears. After Michael, flowers were laid on George's grave by his daughter-in-law and granddaughter. Each of the grieving relatives realized that they were subconsciously waiting for a sign on how to deal with the information that had fallen on them. They didn't talk about it out loud, but Michael, Anne, and Helen were waiting for a revelation to descend on them. Perhaps it was naive and stupid, but I would really like to know what George himself wanted. No matter how much they hoped for a clue, they could not get it, and with a heavy heart, they returned to the apartment. We decided that Michael would live in the house for now, and that his wife and daughter would come to him in their free time. While Anne helped her husband pack at least the minimum necessary things, Helen hurried to the nearest store to buy some special food that was tastier for the yearning cat. The girl felt very sorry for the cat, who seemed to have suddenly lost his luster and lost his previously excellent appetite. After consulting with a serious-looking woman who was busily putting bags of wet food into the cart, Helen collected some gifts for her grandfather's pet and returned home, handing her dad a bag of food. "My dear, I'll ask. He is now a little capricious and may refuse food. Try to feed him from the palm of your hand. He usually starts eating as a sign of respect." He smiled at his daughter. "No, don't worry. I won't offend the tailed one. The days flew by. Just keep up with him." Helen, her mother, went to work, and in the evenings they talked about everything, as the girls were accustomed to from early childhood. Of course, they also talked about the secret that Grandma Kristen had been hiding for. We decided to gather our relatives. We sat together mentally, remembering various incidents from the past. Michael carefully tried to beg it from his great-uncle. "Stepan, can you tell us anything about Dad's youth?" The older man was happy to talk. George was always brave for any good cause, responsive and decisive. When he returned from the army, he went to the factory to get a job in the personnel department. As his mother later said, he heard from someone that young people from our city were sent to build villages and do household work. It was no longer a new thing then. Everyone in the country wanted to help. The people acted in unison. So George, after returning from military service, decided that he would be more useful there. I admit, I also wanted to go with him, but where should I go? In total at that time, I was 15 years old. George is 5 years older than me. In general, he went far. Fortunately, in the Army, he learned to drive a truck and received a license. He returned almost 5 years later. I brought saplings, as if as a souvenir of my long business trip. Of course, he has changed during this time. A naive boy left, but an almost grown man returned. Not because I'm related, but to be fair, I'll say that George definitely hasn't become any worse. I think she can find such Sophie now. His hands are golden and his character is worthy. When here at the automobile plant, they accepted him with open arms. Teetotal, hardworking, honest. What more could you ask for? Hungry for work, and so he will take off his last shirt and give it to someone else. Oh, and the men respected him. No matter what, he never refused. Well, women generally died for him, and he treated everyone very respectfully. Then he married Kristen. She worked at the post office, and somehow the company car broke down, and George was driving by and couldn't leave his fellow driver in trouble. That's how we met. We met briefly and signed, and see, my mother was even offended. It seemed like the holiday was squeezed. But since you, Gina, were born, George was happy. Here in the yard, relatives, neighbors, and colleagues staged a big party. Everyone was invited. It seemed like there weren't any delicacies on the table, but come on, that's not the main thing. It turns out that the atmosphere is much more important. Yes, there was a time when all the neighbors lived almost like relatives. Stefan Alexandrovich interrupted his memories to quench his thirst with a cool, tasty compote. And although he didn't manage to learn anything new that his son didn't know, it was still nice to hear kind words addressed to George. After only Michael, Anne, and Helen remained in the house, the female part of the family cleaned up, leaving the only man, apart from the cat, to dismantle the makeshift benches. Helen went to bed on her favorite cot, and she had a strange, incredibly realistic dream. The girl was not even afraid when she saw Grandfather George at his favorite apple tree. The man stood under the tree, gently stroking the bark and looking at his granddaughter, asking, "When the apples ripen, take a few and give them to those you know. Don't forget, Helen. Please don't forget." Grandfather George looked somewhere, of just trying to see what was happening behind his granddaughter's shoulder. Helen turned to see what or who interested the man, but it was empty. When the girl's gaze returned to the apple tree, Grandfather was no longer under the canopy. Outside the window, birds whistled and sang, tearing Helen out of the captivity of sleep, which left behind a vivid impression. There were no doubts left. Grandfather George conveyed the news, the very sign that was so missing to make the right decision. Of course, he made his desire clear. At his request, Kristen and Helen must go on a trip in the fall so that her grandfather's longtime beloved and their common daughter will find out the whole truth. Shocked, Helen did not hide from her parents that she saw Grandfather George in a dream. Michael was even a little annoyed that the late father in his dreams visited not him, but his granddaughter. But wise Anne supported both her husband and daughter, so it was necessary. There, beyond reality, there are probably its own rules. In anticipation of the holiday, the whole family began preparing for Helen's upcoming trip. The girl's attempts to find Enya and Sophie on social networks were unsuccessful, although she patiently looked through hundreds of pages of users from various regions, and not just from that area. Helen planned to hit the road on the first day of her vacation, so as not to delay the resolution of the issue, which had already been postponed for many years by the will of Kristen's grandmother. The girl's parents, trying not to show their excitement, helped their daughter get ready. They reacted most responsibly to the upcoming transportation of apples, which Grandfather ordered to take with and placed a rectangular basket without a handle in a rather compact but roomy sports bag. She carefully placed the ripe fruits there, laying each layer with parchment paper on her husband's advice, and the main load, carefully covered with a towel, was packed. Helen added the minimum amount of things to her bag and hit the road. At the girl's request, her parents only accompanied her to the taxi, and although the daughter promised to call and report the results of the search, Anne and Michael were worried about their daughter. It is not at all a fact that the search expedition will be successful, and a meeting with a woman from George Ilyach's past could lead to completely unpredictable results. Thanks to a carefully thought-out route and the absence of any unforeseen circumstances, Helen easily reached the village from where Grandfather George had been receiving letters for so long, some of which he was able to read only after his wife's death. The local villages seemed to the girl to be quite a cozy settlement. The coming autumn had already touched the trees with gold and made the village especially picturesque. Private houses coexisted peacefully with apartment buildings, near which in some places there were small vegetable gardens and even greenhouses. The girl approached the house, the address of which was indicated on the envelope. An intercom was installed on the entrance door of a typical 5-story building, and Helen froze for a few seconds in indecision. She, although she was preparing mentally for the trip and even diligently prepared a short speech before the difficult explanation, suddenly became scared. Having overcome herself, Helen typed the number of the apartment she was interested in on the keyboard. Hearing a pleasant female voice from the speakers of the device, the girl asked, he shuddered. "Hello, excuse me, please. Can I talk to Alien and her daughter Sophie? Come in." It came from the speaker, and the door opened. Helen was very surprised that the stranger, whose voice sounded from the speakers, did not ask her either her name or the purpose of meeting her. But there was no time to think. Breathing deeply to calm down, the girl went up to the second floor she needed, where a not-quite-old woman was already waiting for her behind the open door. Helen peered into her face, but in vain. I tried to recognize the stranger Sophie. How, given the fact that in the photograph she was captured at the height of her young 16 years and more than 3 decades had passed, it was unlikely that such drastic changes could have occurred. Outwardly, the woman was of a completely different type, and she looked at most about 40 years old, maybe a little bit older. Is it possible to accurately determine age by the appearance of modern women who take care of themselves, to which the stranger undoubtedly belonged? Helen greeted warmly. "Hello again. I was the one who bothered you. Tell me, please, how can I talk to Alien and Sophie?" The woman conducted the conversation freely, even in a brotherly way, as if she had known Helen for many years. Hello, if you're not joking. From what regions did you come? The question surprised Helen, but she answered honestly, although she did not understand why it mattered. The woman, hearing the name of the city, softened and invited her to enter the apartment, where she asked another strange question. "What are your grandfather's last names?" "My grandfather's last name on my father's side is Johnson, and on my mother's side, Adrian." The uttered phrase had a strange effect on the woman. She didn't ask any more questions. She began to fuss. Despite Helen's excuses, she led her into the kitchen through her plate of delicious rosy pies. She offered tea, coffee, homemade compote, and, holding out a glass of sweet drink to the guests, my mom's best friend was Sophie. She was like a caring nanny and an older sister to me. They survived together even when there was nothing special to eat except potatoes grown in a vacant lot. Meat was seen occasionally, but Alien, as she was planting, was so worried and afraid, and she hoped that one day they would look for her. I firmly told my mother not to tell anyone how to find her and her daughter, except for the man with the last name Johnson or his descendants. She was deeply in love with a certain George Johnson. The daughter is the fruit of their sinful and sweet love. Yes, that's right, George Johnson, my grandfather. Helen confirmed her comment. He passed away recently. Only after this did it become clear that his first love and their common daughter once lived here in your apartment at this very address. It's not Grandpa George's fault that he didn't find them earlier. This is how the circumstances developed. The landlady took a notebook from the closet, tore out a piece of paper, took a pen and flipped through the pages. I began to rewrite something, not forgetting to show cordiality. "You eat, drink. Perhaps you rushed here straight from the station. Refresh yourself. Otherwise, in order to meet Alien or daughter to meet again on the road, you will have to go to another city." They moved. We had to, although it was incredibly difficult for us to part. They became almost family. But after Aunt Alien encountered an acquaintance of the man who kept her as a slave, she was afraid to stay here. It's easier to get lost in a big city. Here you go. I texted you their address and Sophie's phone number to arrange a meeting. Knowing Aunt Alien, I am sure that she is still waiting for news about her beloved. But it's better if you and Sophie discuss the time and place of the meeting. Things aren't going well in their house. My daughter got an extremely nasty husband. When I saw him for the first time, can you imagine? I was even scared. It seems like a person is standing, smiling at you, and his eyes are contemptuous and angry. As my aunt later told me, he helped my daughter a lot in some way when she got a new job in the city, and she fell in love without noticing any of his shortcomings. When I saw it, it was too late, like a fly caught in a web. No matter how hard his aunt tries to get him away from his daughter, it just doesn't work. Lessons, the woman fell silent. Apparently, she herself was worried about this situation, but she did not know how to help the woman whom she considered practically her sister. Helen tried not to look like she was from a hungry region, but she was also unable to refuse the tasty treat and belatedly remembered the rules of etiquette. "Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself, Helen. My name is." "Thank you very much. Your pies are very tasty and the compote is simply wonderful. The woman was very cutely embarrassed. Me, come on. It's me who attacked with interrogation. My name is Alice. By the way, an alien taught me to cook. She is generally a master at cooking. Listen, Helen, do you have money for the trip? A taxi will cost more, but it will be faster than taking a train. Sorry, it's not much, but I can give you $50. Helen was deeply shocked by this proposal. Some Alice seems to be a completely modern young woman in her simple-minded and open behavior, like good characters from old films that grandparents loved to watch. Such a friendly attitude brought tears to Helen's eyes, and she hastened to calm Alice down. Don't worry, my finances are fine. Thank you, Alice. I'm very glad to meet you. Thank you for the treat. It's time to move on. Helen looked at the cost of a taxi to her destination in the app and sighed. Yes, you're right. The price tag is something incredible. It doesn't matter. I'd love to take a ride on the train. Alice didn't let her guess go so easily. Mate. Now we'll look at the schedule of electric trains and passing trains on the internet. Maybe we'll even book a ticket right away. Why are you toiling around in the waiting room in vain? It's better to keep me company here. It's true. Helen nodded, agreeing with Alice's wisdom. But the precaution turned out to be unnecessary. It turned out that given the time it takes to get to the station, you almost have to say goodbye to the hospitable woman. Almost leaving the apartment, Helen hesitated for a while. Opening the bag, she took out several large fragrant apples and handed them to Alice. Here, these are apples from my grandfather's orchard. They are very tasty. I don't know how else to thank you for such a warm welcome. Alice was embarrassed again, but accepted the apples. I can't resist such an incredible aroma and beauty. They are just like the picture. Say hi to Sophie. By the way, I'll probably, with your permission, warn her that you're going to see them. Let her somehow prepare an Oya. Otherwise, you never know, the blood pressure will jump, the heart will catch, or something else. Helen had no objections, and having said a warm goodbye to her new friend, the girl went to the station. Already with the sound of wheels, she sent her parents a detailed story about how the responsive Alice greeted her. She said that Alien and Sophie had moved, but she had their new address. The mother, who was clearly worried about her daughter, responded almost instantly and asked her to be careful on the road. The girl with a light heart promised to look around carefully and not get involved in any dubious adventures. Fortunately, the situation in the carriage was quite calm. Someone peered thoughtfully at the landscape outside the window, becoming less and less visible due to the approaching darkness. Some of the random fellow passengers were dozing, and Helen regretted that she could not, like most passengers in the carriage, immerse herself in communication with a smartphone. The charge level forced me to refrain from this luxury. Almost at the moment when the previous day crossed the border of night to remain forever in the past, Helen found herself in an ancient town standing on the... The girl thought with belated regret that she had not thought to book a hotel room in advance, because showing up at a stranger's apartment at such a late time was somehow completely awkward. The girl felt a little uneasy, but ordering herself not to be a coward, she quickly figured out how to get to the nearest hotel before her smartphone was completely discharged. Luck was with Helen. The administrator, smiling, even seemed to sincerely offer a small, but, in her words, a very cozy room. Soon Helen settled into her temporary housing and, having put her smartphone on charge, took a shower, had dinner, and lay down on the... Although it was late, the mattress was comfortable, no loud sounds penetrated the hotel room, and there was no sleep in either eye. Still, there is a meeting in the morning, for which she went on a trip, and the anxiety appeared again. The girl was thinking for the 100th time about what to say to the innocent victim of deception and how to apologize for her grandmother, and in general, in what style to conduct the conversation. After all, if, with the good-natured Alice, everything somehow turned out very naturally, this does not mean that communication with Ale and Sophie will be just as pleasant. Although she managed to fall asleep only in the morning, Helen woke up a few minutes before the alarm clock, thanks to the girl's youth. The anxious night did not leave any noticeable marks on her appearance, and at 10, she decided to call Sophie. The woman answered almost instantly. It seemed as if she was expecting this call. It is quite likely that this was the case. After all, it's not very often that there are such meetings of relatives who had no idea about each other. Having quickly agreed to meet in one of the cafes located near the hotel, Sophie was the first to end the conversation. Surprisingly, the choice of a neutral public place for the meeting finally calmed Helen, for whom her recent acquaintance with Alice made the most pleasant and even encouraging impression. Well, such a sweet, kind woman simply cannot be friends and consider bad Sophie her family. This means that they are at least quite adequate. In addition, in a cafe surrounded by Sophie, she is unlikely to reach a violent expression of emotions, and there is less risk that Alien will get too nervous. The girl transferred the basket of apples into a spacious shopping bag, which she had prudently taken with her, and went to the meeting. As Helen approached the cafe, she noticed a slender woman on the porch of the establishment, in whose features it was quite possible to see the girl from the photograph from the letter. The girl was the first to say hello and introduce herself. "Hey, hello, Sophie. I'm Helen Johnson. It turns out that my grandfather is your dad," the woman smiled. "Very nice. I tell you quite sincerely, Alice told me that she had wonderful impressions of communication, and her opinion, as life has shown, must be trusted. But let's go. I'll introduce you to Mom, and we'll talk calmly. She's waiting for us inside." The acquaintance procedure turned out to be unusually calm. Alien behaved affably, but with poorly concealed interest, peering into the face of the granddaughter of her beloved man. To somehow break the prolonged silence, Helen handed the woman a berry. "Here, these are apples from your grandfather's orchard." Alien looked up from studying her face and, looking inside the bag, gasped, "No." The woman carefully took out one fruit, looking at it, holding it tenderly, as if the apple were a living creature, and, without addressing either Helen or her daughter, she spoke quietly. It was noticeable that she wanted to express all the accumulated pain. "George and I once dreamed that we would live in a house near which an apple tree would definitely grow. Not just like a fruit tree, but also seemingly in honor of me. What a pity that our dreams did not come true. When we met, I was only 15 years old. However, in my native land, all girls grow up early, mature for family life with a loved one. George was 9 years older. This age difference did not bother me at all. I deceived him. She said that they were already adults, and he couldn't even think that I was lying. We loved each other, forgetting about everything in the world. Probably as punishment for my lies and this sin, higher powers forced me to. Moreover, this terrible punishment also affects my daughter." The woman stroked the hand of her daughter sitting next to her, who blushed like boiled crayfish and fell silent. Helen, listening and without interrupting, "It's not at all that higher powers intervened in your life. Everything is much simpler and more offensive. Grandfather George, I received some of your letters only after the death of my wife, my grandmother." Helen told in detail everything she knew, and, not forgetting to mention her strange dream. "Someday, mate, so I came here so that you know everything. Both my parents and I thought it would be fair. I'm very sorry that your love had such a tragic story, but now nothing can be fixed." Alien held an apple in one hand, pressing it to her heart with her palm, and with the other she wiped away the tears that stubbornly rolled down her cheeks. Neither Sophie nor Helen knew what to say or how to calm the woman in this grief. The silence was like an unspoken minute of silence over George's death. "They haven't ordered drinks or food yet." Alien, as if waking up from a daze, suggested, "My dears, maybe we can walk along the street. I'm missing some air." Helen and Sophie agreed without hesitation, although the waiter, who did not wait for the order or at least a tip, simply looked unhappy. Nobody cared about him. 3 representatives of the fair sex reflected on the vicissitudes of fate and how outside interference destroys the most wonderful dreams. My daughter wanted to take the bag of apples, but Alien stopped her. "I'm sorry, but I don't want to part with these apples." Fortunately, the long handles made it possible to hang the bag on your shoulder, so it wasn't too heavy to carry. Alien asked Helen to tell everything she knew about her grandfather. What kind of work he did, what programs he liked to watch, what he liked to eat, and other everyday little things. The woman seemed to absorb the moments that had passed her by and smiled quietly. Perhaps she imagined that she herself had lived next to him all these years. The almost idyllic walk was interrupted by the ringtone of Sophie's mobile phone. The man who called shouted so loudly that even at a distance of the alley, Helen heard everything he said. "No, why the hell aren't you at home or at work? I was in a hurry on purpose, driving like crazy. And everything is like in a bad joke. Where are you going? Look, if I find out that you're cheating on me, I'll kill everyone, and you and your mother will fly out of my apartment like little kids." Stately Sophie, listening to the tirade, seemed to become smaller in stature. The lights in her eyes went out, and she answered briefly, "I'll be there now." Alien became noticeably agitated. It seems that the voice of the man who called was well known to her, and this man did not evoke the slightest positive emotions in her. Sophie began to say goodbye to Helen and then turned to her mother. "Listen, I'll run. Boris seems to be on edge already, and you can talk some more. You probably would like to talk about a lot of things." She hurried to leave, and from that moment, the casual conversation seemed to evaporate. The girl understood. The woman was terribly afraid for her daughter, who, as it was easy to understand, was in a relationship with a real tyrant. Soon Alien confirmed the guess of her young companion. I have the impression that my bitter story of slavery and the power of a cruel, domineering man is now being continued by my daughter. She, however, got married, unlike me, quite officially, and even out of great love. That's how it seemed at least 15 years ago. I was so happy for my daughter. Boris always treated me, and even more so her, with respect. But as soon as he managed to persuade me to add my savings to a shared apartment, the relationship began to deteriorate instantly, gradually. One thing didn't suit him, then another. While I was huddled separately in a rented room, separate from my daughter and son-in-law, I had no idea how everything really was. Then, 5 years ago, I became seriously ill and went on long sick leave. In general, I had to ask Boris to come to their 2-room apartment. It seems that I felt that I had the moral right to do this, but, of course, I felt uneasy. Nothing. She hid her pride somewhere far away and asked to stay with her daughter and Boris. Then I saw that not everything was fine with them. There are always some complaints against my daughter, jealousy, hurtful words. In a milder version than before, the monster oppressed me, but every reproach against Sophie was a punishment for me. Recently, he began to accuse me of infertility, although he himself always repeated that children were not included in his life plans. I get the impression that he is provoking Sophie to divorce, and then when we exchange the apartment, we will get some kind of closet. I now clearly understand that Boris will share everything thoroughly down to every spoon, and that she and I are like 2 blades of grass that can be broken like spitting. I have no legal education. Sophie is also far from this. We cannot afford a good lawyer financially. Helen did not know how to console the unhappy woman who had never in her life been able to lean on a reliable man's shoulder. Instead of rushing into battle with all the troubles yourself, it seems that friendship with Alice's mother is the only bright spot in her life, even if it was not easy. But when no one tries to solve the problems, it is at least morally easier. As soon as I lost my permanent job and started baking at home, the fragile balance collapsed. Somehow everything went downhill, although the standard of living even seemed to become higher. I can probably pay for my rented apartment again, but here's the irony of fate. I simply began to fear for my daughter's health. How afraid I am that Boris will start raising his hand against Sophie. And now there's something uneasy in my heart, as if some kind of trouble is approaching. Helen, I don't want to involve you in our family squabbles, but come to us, please. With you. Boris should moderate his ambition. He always does this in the presence of strangers, enthusiastically and even selflessly. Plays the role of an exemplary husband. If you ask our neighbors, everyone will probably unanimously say that my Sophie is incredibly lucky to have him. Helen immediately agreed to join us. Soon, after traveling a few bus stops and walking a little along the street, they found themselves inside the apartment. A muffled male voice was heard from one of the rooms. "Now I'll teach you how to greet your husband, because in such fools as you need to put the thought into not wagging your tail in the absence of your legal spouse." Alien opened the door and saw Boris grab Sophie by the neck, lifting her off the floor. In a state of some kind of irrational anger, the woman took the bag of apples from her shoulder and hit her son-in-law on the head with it. The man, having let go of his victim, as if knocked down, collapsed on the floor, freezed from coughing. "Mom, what are you doing? What fly bit you? What if you broke Boreas' skull?" Len slowly walked up to the sofa, sat down on it, and asked, "Sophie, nothing will happen to Boris. Better bring me some water with a sedative. My heart is starting to pound." Helen, meanwhile, looked closely at the man. He was clearly not too stunned and was already trying to get up. She looked dumbfounded. Boris was in no hurry to get up, and, rubbing the back of his head, angrily collapsed on Alien and began to threaten. "Don't even think that this will be in vain. I'll go and film the beatings at the emergency room and put you, the senile old woman, behind bars." Sophie's hand shook as she handed the cup of medicine to her mother. The woman began to persuade Boris not to get excited, but he only became more unruly and uttered threats. "You'll go and eat gruel until you die, and then you'll die in a government house. And with your health, there's no point in being there. Unexpectedly, Boris's tirade was interrupted by Helen, who unwillingly, along with her grandfather and father, watched a variety of detective series and had, albeit small, but valuable experience in calming down even the most inappropriate office visitors and presumptuous suppliers. First of all, I'll call the police here right now. I saw with my own eyes how you tried to harm Sophie. So Alien's actions may well qualify as causing grievous bodily harm in self-defense, but you may have much more serious problems. Believe me. Helen herself could not understand how she had the audacity to tell an adult man some numbers of articles of the criminal code emerging from the depths of the subconscious. Stress probably took its toll. She used some legal terms so boldly that Boris, under the furious pressure of the stranger, noticeably became shy, and then, carefully getting up, left the room, saying to his wife, "You're lucky that I have a strong head, otherwise I would have become a widow." When the man left, Helen sat down on the sofa next to Alien. The woman began to apologize to the guest. Sorry, Helen, that this happened." Low inside the girl was still shaking with anger. She managed to answer almost calmly, "There's nothing to apologize for at all." Sophie, standing near the wall, listened to what was happening in the kitchen, where Boris had gone, and then she rushed there, surprising her mother and Helen. The man was busy climbing through the cabinets in a fit of rage. He threw everything out of them right onto the floor, quietly called out to her son-in-law, "Boris, calm down. I hid my stash a long time ago. As soon as I noticed that the bills began to gradually disappear from there, you won't find anything in the kitchen, don't hope." The man, not knowing where he was stepping, crushed cereals and pasta, left the kitchen, almost knocked down Sophie, who was in his way, and soon slammed the door loudly. And Sophie began to clean up the consequences of the destruction caused by Boris, and Helen, without thinking for long, joined them. In response to the hostess's objections, the girl admitted, "Partly I feel a little guilty for everything that happened, so of course I won't stand aside." The mess in the kitchen was almost eliminated when Boris appeared in the doorway, accompanied by a man in a police uniform. Hello. Boris invited me to look into the circumstances of the beating. Alien sank into a chair, exhausted. Sophie looked angrily at her husband, who, on the contrary, was jubilant. While the women were cleaning up, he made a fuss and literally dragged a law enforcement officer into the apartment, greatly exaggerating the scale of the conflict, naturally, without telling you that before the ill-fated blow to the back of the head, he almost sent his wife to the next world. Helen was amazed at Boris's impudence and blurted out to eliminate the possibility of a dirty trick from this man with a rotten and petty soul. "Excuse me, can I see your ID?" The lieutenant presented the documents and began the interview. While Elena began to talk about what happened, Helen asked permission to call. The policeman did not interfere, and the girl hurried to dial her father's number. Michael listened to his daughter without interrupting, and then said, "In general, Victor will call you back now. He is well versed in such matters. You put the phone on speakerphone, and I think he will be able to resolve this situation favorably and without unnecessary hassle." Helen's father was not mistaken. Boris's triumphant appearance melted as, during a telephone conversation, the policeman, seeing red prints on Sophie's neck, began to cast disapproving glances at the impudent man. The lawyer insisted that the lieutenant also accept a statement from the woman who had been attacked by her husband. And this speech had a wonderful effect. After the mutually amiable completion of telephone conversations, the man sternly asked Boris, "Are you still saying that your wife's mother hit you with a heavy bag for no reason at all?" The picture of this incident is completely different. You, Boris, practically made a false call and even lied. This case, unfortunately, is not subject to jurisdiction, but it is quite possible to run into a fine. Now I will write everything down as it happened and warn you right away. You don't need to deceive me anymore. When Alien showed her terrible remedy, which she applied to her son-in-law, the policeman could hardly contain his smile and involuntarily admired the large elegant apples. Boris, having read and signed the document drawn up, showered curses and abuse on his wife, her mother, and their young intercessor who had come from nowhere. The district police officer reprimanded the man, and he left the apartment in a rage. The policeman, turning to Sophie, said, "I will advise you simply as a human being. Do not tolerate such an attitude. Further, as experience shows, similar marriages do not lead to anything good. It's not too late to get a divorce." Sophie thanked the district police officer. Thank you for your informal approach. We handled the situation fairly. Alien put almost half of the apples Helen had brought in a bag to the district police officer and handed it over with the words, "Please accept it as a token of gratitude. I am very embarrassed that my intemperance caused my son-in-law to disturb you." The district police officer shrugged his shoulders, saying that's the job. And then, as if having thrown off the plaque, he formally asked with admiration in his voice, "How did you manage to grow such beautiful apples? At my parents' dacha this year, almost the entire harvest was destroyed by hail at the ovary stage. What was not beaten rotted during the frost." Alien smiled. I myself didn't expect to admire such apples. This is a famous variety. The defender generously brought these apples to us from another region, where a seedling was delivered many years ago from a southern country by a very good person, despite the difference in climate. The tree has taken root. The police officer thanked him again for the apples, dictated his phone number just in case, and saying goodbye, left the apartment. Despite the successful solution to the problem, Boris's petty revenge in the form of calling the police turned out to be a rather exhausting event for everyone, Bale jokingly stating, "That's it. We've had enough cleaning for today. Where has this been seen? A girl came to visit us, and we gave her a broom and dustpan. That's it, girls. Let's set the table in my room. With this hoard, we will be completely starved." Helen was removed from preparing for the feast, and she hurried to call her dad to report that the conversation with the lawyer had helped her get out of a very difficult situation. Michael and Anne, who knew a noticeably softened version of events from her husband, were relieved when their daughter reported this information. Still, even at 24 years old, Helen remained for her parents the same beloved little girl whom they wanted to protect, to cover with their care like a dome, impenetrable to all kinds of evil. As Alice said, Anna turned out to be an incredibly skilled craftswoman when it comes to food. Helen enjoyed trying the seemingly simple but extremely tasty bassifaye. After tea with delicious and homemade sweets, Sophie asked her guest, "Can we arrange a video conference on Skype with your dad? I would like to get to know my half-brother at least in this remote way." Helen admitted, "My parents also asked me about this, but I didn't know how to offer it. Is it convenient?" Alien threw out her hands. His daughter, "My clever girl, what a good idea you came up with. Come on quickly, set everything up." Just a few minutes later, an image of Michael appeared on the laptop screen. First of all, the man began to ask Alien for forgiveness. "It's difficult for me to talk about this, but the happiness of my parents' family and my, in fact, carefree childhood were actually built on the foundation of your misfortunes. Most likely, if letters from you had fallen into the hands of your father earlier, he would probably have found a way to help you. However, my mother was most likely afraid that he would give up everything and ask for a divorce. And he will go to you and his daughter, whom he never had the chance to meet. I sincerely apologize to you, Sophie. I want you to know that you can always count on me. Helen will leave you my phone number and other contacts. Contact us anytime you need it." Helen sat with the hospitable hostesses until the evening, listening and talking about herself and her family. Despite the rather strange circumstances of meeting, no one felt the slightest awkwardness. "I didn't even think that I would suddenly have such a wonderful niece." Alien, named Sophie for Helen, saw in her a subtle, almost imperceptible resemblance to George. Similar facial features, dimples, the funny habit of wrinkling your nose and frowning when you smile. For so many years, the woman remembered the only man she loved desperately, and then, as if out of habit, she hoped to meet. And now there is no more chance to see each other. It was incredibly sad, and there was only one consolation. George did not forget her and did not betray her. I naively believed what she said then. That's the only thing she could reproach him for, even if she wanted to. Countless times, Alien imagined that she had handled that fateful conversation differently. If only then, more than half a century ago, she had only found the courage to tell her beloved that her father was threatening to kill him if she had offered to run away. However, George would probably have found a more correct way to solve the problem. If only she had honestly told him everything many years ago. Most likely they would now be together as they dreamed. Maybe for Sophie, who would have felt the care and support of her father in her personal life, everything would have turned out much more successfully. Everything would have been much better. And she would not have gotten involved with this slippery, nasty Boris. She incredibly regretted that she was unable to protect her fragile love. But she couldn't blame the woman who became George's legal wife for this. In the end, it was she, even under pressure, who rejected her loved one. This means there is no point in looking for someone to blame on the side. The day turned out to be long, eventful, and after a hearty meal and long conversations, those sitting at the table began to yawn, either one by one or all at the same time. Helen flatly refused to be escorted to the hotel. "Don't worry, please. The taxi will take me directly to the place, so there will be no difficulties. As soon as I'm in my room, I'll let you know right away." Sophie said goodbye to Helen as a close relative, with whom they share not only blood ties but also friendship, before getting into taxi. The girl waved to her new acquaintances for a long time, looking out of the window, and did not notice how Boris, who was holding a grudge, was approaching her from a bench installed at the next entrance. The man believed that it was this strange young upstart, whom he saw today, for the first time in his life, who was to blame for the unsuccessful day. Just think, he grabbed it lightly, but it hurt her why she left the house and didn't even think to inform him. It is clear that the matter is unclean. He, as a husband, had every right to teach her how a decent woman should behave. And this little girl, instead of apologizing, began to argue with him, explaining that she had not done anything wrong, so he cut off her oxygen, a little to discourage her. And then, as luck would have it, the evil fury came at the wrong time and hit him on the head with all. Boris touched the back of his head, feeling a painful lump, and continued to think about the insult that he had to endure. Surely everything would not have turned out at all joyfully for the wife and her foolish mother, if not for an unfamiliar face. The devil dared her to end up in their apartment today. The man was sure that without the support of this educated trash, women would not have dared to blather in his direction. Moreover, he would have been able, most likely would have been able to convince the district police officer that the women were conspiring against him. But this young sheep turned out to have a trump card after the intervention of an obviously competent lawyer who knew all the laws. He, Boris, had to leave the apartment as a beggar, although he also has the right to square meters. However, the battle for them is still ahead. In the meantime, we need to deal with these insolent women. Of course, he's now breaking in on his wife and her mother. It's no use. They were probably locked with all the locks and a chain. But to lie in wait and teach a lesson, that would be right. It was for this reason that Boris sat on the bench, sort of like a predator in ambush, waiting for Sophie to see when the defenseless sheep leaves the herd and finds itself in his power. The man even laughed and was glad that he had found such a comparison. But the wait dragged on. The autumn evening, gentle and merciless, had already begun to hint that the planned hunt would not take place. Boris was trembling, either from suppressed rage or from hunger and cold, and was about to leave. But then the entrance door opened and a girl jumped out into the street. Boris's joy was somewhat premature because the impudent sheep climbed into the taxi. But this only provoked the man. The chase is the chase. Luckily, the cars are nearby. In the meantime, heavy traffic in the city will not allow the future victim to disappear from view. Helen had already grabbed the door handle to the hotel, dreaming of quickly collapsing on the bed and getting some sleep. But she heard a voice behind her. The girl automatically turned around and lost precious fractions of a second. Boris, whose voice she recognized very well, was rapidly approaching her. Helen turned away and, trying to quickly get into the hotel, out of fear began to push the doors in the wrong direction. When finally salvation was close, the man grabbed her by the waist, turned her to face him, and began to threaten her in a falsely affectionate tone. "Where were you in such a hurry? Explain to me, why the hell are you interfering in my family life? Why are you silent sheep? Who asked you to intervene?" The girl prepared to scream loudly and wondered how to free herself. But I didn't have to look for salvation on my own. She could not see how a district police officer, who was already in civilian clothes, appeared from the slightly open door behind her, but she was incredibly happy when she heard, "Boris, you are completely wrong now. Let the girl go." There were steely notes in the policeman's voice, and Boris instantly loosened his grip and made excuses to the district police officer. "I just came to talk." Then I thought of inviting him for a walk and showing him the city. The policeman, leaving the hotel, asked, "Helen, if you don't mind, wait for me in the foyer. I need to agree on something with Boris." Helen sat down in a comfortable chair. A few minutes later, a local police officer sat down next to him and admitted, I actually came to see you. My parents immediately lost peace when they saw the apples. They asked me to come to an agreement with you about the cuttings. His father wants to vaccinate him and try to grow such beauty too." And I can't count how many times the markets have cheated with varieties. The picture shows one thing, but what emerges is something completely different. So I came here to the hotel, and as it turns out, it's not in vain. The girl smiled. She liked this young and somehow very correct and principled policeman. In gratitude for her salvation, she promised him to send as many Sherenkov as she wanted when she got to her grandfather 2 houses away. They exchanged contacts and said goodbye. The man did not want to part with the charming girl, but he could no longer find any reason to stay close to her. It seems that it was not in vain that Grandfather George sent me to look for Sophie in my dreams. He also advised me to take apples with me. Events after meeting the relatives began to develop with frightening speed. Sophie divorced Boris, and after exchanging the apartment, they moved at the invitation of Michael to his father's house. The man suggested from the bottom of his heart, "Since I am aware of my mother's guilt, let this house be at least a small compensation for all your suffering," and sat for a long time by the apple tree, carefully grown by his loved one, stroking it like a living creature. And Helen, who was always a welcome guest, was glad that the elderly woman, although belatedly, had found peace. In the personal life of the granddaughter, the glossy fruits of the airport also played an important role. Correspondence and regular telephone conversations with Sergio, that policeman, helped to find out that their sympathy is mutual and does not weaken over time, but even becomes stronger. Soon the lieutenant moved to the city to live with his girlfriend, explaining, "Well, our police required everywhere, and if necessary, I can master another profession." Sophie also found her personal happiness when she met a man in a new city. Anna, stroking the apple tree, quietly whispered, "Thank you, George. I know for sure that it was you who helped arrange everything so successfully."